Hi. Hello. Welcome to the Catella Bubble, where we discuss the British royal family, UK politics, and the media. Here we ask the difficult questions, like what does the future of the Windsor family look like after such a crazy and hectic year? And monarchy, why? Which makes this the perfect place to talk about a book that has been getting quite a lot of coverage in the royal commentary sphere. And that is Endgame by Omid Scobie. I first listened to the audiobook on Spotify when it first came out. The audiobook is nice in that it has Omid Scobie as the reader, which I think gives it a nice touch. It's always nice when the author of the book is the reader for the audiobook. It's also the first book that I've listened to on Spotify Premium, so I highly recommend if you have a Spotify Premium account and you didn't know that now you can get all of these audiobooks, highly recommend you check out what you have access to now. You can also look for it, wherever you get your digital and audiobooks. But I mean, if you're already paying for Spotify, might as well, right? And I think this is a great audiobook to just put on like in the car. If you're not like a super hardcore royal commentary nerd like myself, it's a pretty easy listen, and it kind of has like podcast vibes to it. Like the stories nicely transition in and out to each other. As an audiobook, I think it's pretty good for even just a casual listen if you are interested in the book at all. So my first pass of the book was quite casual. I was mostly just taking it all in, getting the gist. But even with a cursory listen, I was incredibly impressed with this book. And I knew pretty much immediately that I wanted to cover this book, but when I finally received my hardback copy, I started highlighting and annotating this thing like crazy. Just looking at how much I've highlighted and annotated in this first half of the book, I'm pretty sure that this review is gonna come in two parts. So for today, we're just going to be doing a deep dive on chapters 1 to 7, and then we'll look at chapters 8 through 15 in the next video. So be on the lookout for that one. So the goal of today's video is to review the book, but also to dive deep into Scobie's evidence, analysis, and argumentation as he presents it in the book, and basically see how it all fits in. Why is this book so important to royal commentators? Why has this book gotten so much flack? And what does this represent about how royal commentators will cover the monarchy going forward? Because one thing this book is not, this ain't your mother's royal biography. Oh no. If you've watched any of my TikToks reading other royal biographies, you know the same tropes and narratives that get put out there by biographers who work closely with the palace or with specific people within the family for those biographies. Endgame works within those royal biography frameworks, but also brings it to a whole nother level that was really lacking in some of the previous biographies that I've read. But before we get into all of that, let's just start with some background. Firstly, who is Omid Scobie? Omid Scobie is a British journalist / royal reporter who started reporting on the royal family for Us Weekly around 2011 or so. He's also been a guest royal commentator for other TV news programs and newspapers, and he started to make a name for himself in the royal commentary scene for his reporting specifically on Meghan Markle entering the royal family.
At university, I really thought my career would be in newspapers and that I would work in, I was interested in entertainment news and I wanted to go down that path. And at that time, the celebrity columns, the entertainment news coverage in the British papers was making waves around the world. Suddenly we had columns that were getting, the journalists themselves were getting Vanity Fair profiles, and it was kind of like where it was at. And it was only once I got to sort of step inside and have a look around, I thought, you know what, this is maybe for someone else. And so I took a job at a magazine. I saw a lot of things there at this same publication that I felt, oh, this is straight out of the newspaper rule book. These same things are happening at the magazines too. So it really then changed how I felt my career was going, where it was going. And I thought, well, I've got to find somewhere else. And so I looked to the US and I took a job running the European Bureau. and the whole overseas operation for Us Weekly, it was like the younger version of Rolling Stone magazine at the time. Same publisher, same goals, same house style, a lot of the same staff. So it was a natural fit, and it was there where I really kind of learned that things could be done differently. We didn't even pay for stories, so it was a very different way of doing things compared to the UK papers.
Before Endgame, his biggest claim to fame was the book Finding Freedom, which he co-wrote with Carolyn Durand in 2020. Unlike many other royal biographies which come and go, Finding Freedom gained some more traction within the press because of its more insider look into Megxit. Before we had more information coming out about the inner conflicts which caused Harry and Meghan to leave the UK. It was released before the Harry and Meghan Netflix docuseries and Prince Harry's Spare, both of which I've talked a lot about on this channel, so go watch all of that. So it was kind of the first book that looked at the Harry and Meghan situation from a more sympathetic lens in a media climate that was very hostile to Harry and Meghan.
For me, I never went out of my way to be different, but I did see this sort of like ever growing gap in the story that just wasn't being told. And there's only a handful of us, and it just felt like, well, if it's not me, then it's not going to be anyone.
And still had a lot of misinformation and disinformation being disseminated, especially in royal commentary, royal reporting spaces. Now, I never finished Finding Freedom, but I did read parts of it to prepare for this review. Overall, I think it's an interesting book about the Harry and Meghan situation and their exit from being working royals, and it shows some of the more unique insights that Scobie brings into his royal coverage, which I think shows itself better in Endgame. But from what I did read of Finding Freedom, I kind of see why Scobie is trying to distance himself somewhat from that book. He's already previously admitted that there were certain things in Finding Freedom where he and his co-author were a bit uncritical about certain things that were leaked by the palace that ended up in the book. For example, there's an anecdote in the book that Meghan Markle received like special ops training or self-defense training in her new role, which now after the fact we know was not true and is actually said to not be true in Prince Harry's Spare, for example. Scobie also notes that writing the book with a co-author as well kind of makes it not totally the book, and I think that causes some tensions with how he feels about the book in hindsight. I can also tell from what Scobie has said about the book after the fact that he was probably trying to maintain certain connections within the industry, and so therefore it changed how things are presented in the book.
You are not beholden to the palace anymore, or to Clarence House anymore.
Or
are you? Because
at that point,
you still need to keep them sweet.
Still close. Because,
so when did that
because
fracture?
She was entering.
Of
that.
course. So we're talking about that period then when it was all still going through official channels.
So actually, at that point, as I'd established myself as someone who was capable of perhaps telling a more fair or accurate version of the story, or one that's closer to her position on the ground. When we went to Kensington Palace, so Carolyn Durand, who was my producer, Royals producer at Good Morning America and ABC News for many years, when we decided to do a book on Harry and Meghan together, we both approached the palace, the head of comms. And we're like, we want to do this book. We've got great sources. We feel like we've been covering this story in a fair and factual way. How can you help us? And that's pretty much the norm for any journalist that is writing a book on a member of the royal family. Especially if you're a royal correspondent.
Even though it's an unauthorised biography, there's still an understanding.
And I think maybe in hindsight, Omid Scobie thinks that he could have maybe pushed more or been more rigorous in fact-checking or just checking in general the narratives that were presented in Finding Freedom. But overall, I do think that the book is interesting, especially if you think of it as sort of a spiritual prequel to Endgame. You can see bits and pieces in Finding Freedom of this new, unique perspective on royal biography, which I really appreciate in Endgame. but maybe wasn't quite there when he was putting together Finding Freedom with his co-author. But now with all of that out of the way, what are my overall thoughts on Endgame? The first thing I want to say about the book is that I love the chess metaphor of the book. I've recently been playing a lot of chess online. It's kind of been an addiction for like the past month or two for me. I'm still absolutely terrible at chess, but I have tried to learn some basic chess theory and tactics. So I appreciate the parallels that Omid makes between chess and the royal family. If you're a bit more unfamiliar with chess, the title Endgame is a reference to one of the three main parts of a chess game. So in chess, there are three parts to a game. The first part is the opening, next is the middle game, and finally is the end game. In chess openings, the goal is to develop your pieces, get them off of the starting squares, place your pieces on squares where they can be more powerful, support each other, threaten other pieces on the other side, essentially to set up all of your pieces in the best possible locations so that you can make attacks on your opponent. In chess middle game, the objective becomes less about developing your pieces and more about using tactics and strategies to attack your opponent. It's also more commonly where you will start to trade and exchange pieces, but you will never keep all of your pieces in a game of chess. It's just not how chess works, which I think also makes the metaphor with the royal family make a lot of sense. Using the value of the different chess pieces, you as the player have to sort of strategize about what you are willing to give up in order to maintain a higher position on your opponent. But if you make strategic sacrifices that ensure that you maintain the upper hand either in point value or in your position on the board, then you are setting yourself up for a better end game. In the end game of chess, after that middle game where you and your opponent have exchanged or lost multiple pieces, endgame becomes about using the few pieces that you have remaining to secure checks and checkmates on your opponent. As opposed to openings and middle games in chess, endgames are notoriously difficult for people because they require a lot of training to master. With so few pieces on the board, in the endgame you have to be very efficient about where you move all your pieces in every turn. Endgames can also be tricky as well because depending on which pieces you have left remaining, checking or checkmating your opponent's king can be either much easier if you have a lot of stronger pieces remaining, or incredibly difficult, if not impossible, if you have weaker pieces remaining. So when we analyze this metaphor that Scobie is using of chess endgame and the monarchy, I think it's interesting that the book is kind of trying to think about what pieces are still remaining on the monarchy's chessboard, so to speak. In the metaphor that Scobie is setting up, the chess game that's being played is the monarchy versus the world, the people, the public. And although he doesn't hammer this point home, the chess metaphor really becomes pro-monarchy and anti-monarchy, upholding the institution of the monarchy perpetually, or a win for the public, for democracy, and for anti-monarchist sentiment to spread and end the monarchy once and for all. And with this metaphor, it's interesting that Scobie's thesis of the book is essentially analyzing what pieces does the monarchy still have available to it, what with numerous things that have happened in the past couple of years that means that certain pieces are now effectively off the board, whether the pieces that are left remaining in the endgame are powerful enough and coordinated enough together to checkmate the opponent, or essentially to allow the monarchy to continue, for the monarchy to win out in the end. But if they don't have powerful enough pieces, if those pieces are not coordinated well and they don't carefully strategize how to move those pieces, they could very well lose the endgame in this metaphor and effectively end the monarchy as a whole, as an institution. And Scobie is one of the first royal biographers to not shy away from the fact that there is growing Republican sentiment in this day and age that could spell trouble for the monarchy moving forward as more and more people go, maybe this whole system doesn't make any goddamn sense. I'm not gonna lie, my heart is aflutter at the idea that this might be the end game for the monarchy. The metaphor itself, I think, is such a strong metaphor. It works really well, and it's a great through line for understanding and unpacking the entire thesis of the book itself. I also think that the chapter titles and the opening quotations for each chapter do a really great job of conveying the overall themes of the book as a whole, but also for each specific chapter in and of itself, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Some chapter titles complement each other really well. For example, chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 8 is called Gloves On. Chapter 9 is called Gloves Off. They also pack a lot better punches than other royal biographies that I've read. For example, chapter 4, Remembrance of Things Past, the ongoing campaign to make the royals great again. Like, come on. That's obviously a great chapter title. It's really dangling a big claim there. One that I think is sufficiently backed up by evidence, but one that's immediately recognizable from the title. It's just very smart. The whole structure of the book, I think, is really smart and intelligent in a way that a lot of royal biographies are not. This book made me feel like I was not crazy, which made me feel so relieved. I kept reading the book and thinking, oh my God, this is what I've been saying the whole time on my channel. There were so many things, especially early on in the book, where I'd be reading and thinking like, yes, oh my goodness, somebody's finally saying this. Yes, there are parallels here between the royal family and Trump. Yes, we're finally unpacking the racism of the institution. Yes, we're finally unpacking the relationship between the conservative government and the royal family. Finally. I'm not saying that Omid's version of events or his explanations are definitive fact, but I feel like a lot of what he said confirmed a lot of my previous thoughts and better expressed them more eloquently than I have in some of my previous work on my channel. Now, of course, we should be skeptical of things that conform to our beliefs, right? I don't want to fall into confirmation bias when unpacking parts of the book. And I hope I do show that I've read this book critically. But some passages were just so breathtaking in how they were able to say what I've been trying to say with my work and my channel for over a year now. Speaking of which, I've been on YouTube on this channel for about a year, so if you want to help support me, click subscribe, click like, leave a comment, argue with me, go for it. Help me out with the algorithm. I would love it. Thank you. All right, is it time to get into the book? It's time. Let's get into it, shall we? And of course, looking at the back cover, that's exactly where the book is starting off. So the first chapter is a prologue, and it opens up with Omid Scobie discussing the lingering dread or the big elephant in the room when he first started royal reporting, which was that everybody knew at a certain point when the queen was starting to get up there in age that at some point news was going to arrive that she was dead. And the press had kind of been bracing themselves for a while for this news to hit. Scobie uses the imagery of this black suit that he used to carry around just in case he would get the call that the queen was finally dead. Unfortunately, when the queen actually did pass away, Scobie did not have his black suit in tow. In the newsroom, when he does get the news that the queen has passed, he receives confirmation of the queen's passing before the palace has put out any official statement to say that the queen has passed. Which, if you think about it from the perspective of like Prince Harry, for example, is kind of sad and horrifying. Numerous reporters and royal commentators were able to receive the news of the queen's passing and prepare in a way that Prince Harry was not afforded. He did not receive any information from his family about the queen's passing until he landed and saw the news on his phone. Omid Scobie is essentially admitting that he knew of the queen's passing before some members of her own family did. And I think that's a really interesting note to start the book on, because I think it highlights really well the sort of gross relationship between the press and the royal family, where they are so up in each other's business all the time, even when the insiders in the royal family don't even afford that kind of information to other members of their family. Omid doesn't comment on this, but I'm commenting on it because I find it's really sad, and I think it really highlights, especially in Spare, why Prince Harry felt really betrayed by his family when the queen passed, as he was very much cut off from a lot of information coming from the family about her condition. And it seems pretty obvious that it was intentional, which seems really cruel and callous to do to one of the queen's grandsons. So Scobie gets the news, he goes off to see the queen's coffin, and I wanted to read this part because I thought it really well articulated what the book itself is doing in a way that I found unique and interesting. Lying next to the pillowed crown were the orb and scepter. I'd seen them in person before many times, but being so close to the two symbols in this setting gave me goosebumps. There was the weight of history and tradition, yes, but also the aura of mystery and myth. Ordinary things in and of themselves, really, but an accruement of time. The narratives of power and divine lineage dictated over centuries, and the human desire for meaning and order all alchemized, transmuting those things into powerful ideas. It was a strange, commanding magic that I felt that day in Westminster. But the woman, the human form of all that regal authority and mysterious poetry, was lying in a coffin underneath. For so long she stood for the crown and the crown for her. Without her presence, these ornaments and symbols seemed exposed, naked somehow, as if they had been caught unawares. I wanted to highlight that paragraph because I think it's interesting how Scobie talks about the idea that narratives can be changed and transmutated, and that there can be a certain magic in narratives, a certain power in narratives. And I noted here in an annotation in my copy that the book itself tries to change narratives. And the book notes that there is power in that process of changing narratives. These traditional symbols of the crown possess a mysterious power that has been created through narrative, through storytelling, a story that we tell ourselves about that divine right, about the importance of this family having power over subjects. And those narratives get put onto these objects, onto these places, these palaces, onto the clothing that royals wear. And then it's a sort of alchemy. And I like the word alchemized because alchemy is a pseudoscience. It's a science that's not real. Turning lead into gold. Something that people strove to prove to be true because they wanted the gold at the end. But it is a fiction. We cannot change lead into gold, and in some ways, the monarchy is trying to create alchemy. They are trying to change something into a big, powerful symbol through this sort of magical process. But if it's not real science, if the magic wears off, these objects, these things, become meaningless. They no longer have the power that they represent if the narratives around them are destroyed. I think that's a great place for the book to start off. It's about really questioning those narratives and trying to maybe take away some of that pseudoscience of the alchemy, trying to replace it with a real science, things that we can actually observe and we have evidence of. And I think it's a great way of describing how this book is going to shift away from other royal biography narratives that fit into this pro-monarchy narrative as a whole, and how we're going to move into different narrative, you know, peeling back the curtain somewhat and talking about the monarchy as a political institution, about its connections to journalists and the press, its connections to the Conservative Party. And when you talk about those things, you're losing the magic, you're losing the fairy tale, but you might be putting away the alchemy. Omid shifts from talking about the Queen to talking about Charles. And through this prologue, we can kind of see that the prologue kind of mirrors where all of the chapters are going to go. So we start the prologue talking about the Queen, which will be the discussion in chapter 1. He then shifts to talking about Charles as the new king, will be more so in chapter 2. Well, 2 and 3, I suppose. So I think the prologue does a great job of trying to link together where the thesis is and how all these chapters are going to fit together in an overarching argument. But one thing I would like to note is specifically how he interprets Charles. He notes, "A stubborn eccentric who has spent most of his life waiting and planning for his ascension, even at the cost of his relationships with his own sons, the former Prince of Wales is not only far less popular than his predecessor and his successor, he has also been a thorn in the side of the institution. Despite the fact he's well liked by world leaders and global power figures during the life of his mother, he was never fully embraced by power brokers within the system, the palace operators and partisans with links to the British establishment, including the government." I thought this was interesting because I never really thought of it as Charles being well liked in this certain sphere of world leaders and external influences. Charles being unpopular within Britain, within these establishments, makes a lot of sense. He's made a lot of miscalculations, and I'm sure a lot of people within the institution and these establishments probably think Charles is a bit annoying for not taking, like, the obvious way out of a lot of these situations. I think it's kind of an odd balance to keep if Charles is well supported by powerful figures outside of these UK institutions, because I think it kind of already loses some of the shine of the magic of the royal family, who is meant to represent this quintessential British identity, who is meant to have his feet firmly planted in the British establishment. I think it's interesting that Scobie tries to bust this myth and essentially say that within these British spheres of influence, Charles is actually not very well liked. He's not very popular. He's a bit of an annoying character for them. People don't think that he has what it takes, really, to lead the family in a direction for the monarchy to maintain its relevance. And I think it's especially interesting to note that this includes the British government, which I think is also interesting considering that even as soon as King Charles took the throne, there was already a lot of tension between him and the Conservative government. Scobie later on talks about how Liz Truss and then later Rishi Sunak asked King Charles not to go to COP26, I think. Scobie reiterates something that has already come up in lots of biographies, which is, quote, "Charles may be the next king, but William is, quote unquote, the future." It makes a lot of sense. With Charles having to wait so long to ascend to the throne, it's pretty clear he doesn't have a lot of years left in him. Plus, there's a lot of tensions between him and all of these establishment figures. Pretty much everyone in the know in this royal commentary sphere thinks of Charles as not really something for the monarchy to bank on. Nobody's expecting him to be the one to bring the monarchy into the 21st century, to carry it into the future, to maintain its relevance. Everybody within those spheres of influence is already looking towards William to be the future. This is something that I've tried to highlight on my channel a lot more. We tend to talk a lot about Charles because it's pretty easy to dunk on him, really. He's pretty memeable. He's laughably out of touch with reality. But a lot of people seem to ignore William or try to cast him as sort of this like supervillain, which I don't think is true. But William kind of like is skirting by under the radar. A lot of people don't click, oh, this guy's gonna be king. pretty soon. In a very short period of time from the monarchy's perspective, William will be king, and he represents where the monarchy is going to go into the future. But he doesn't get a lot of coverage in that vein. He's started to make a lot more waves with kind of discussing what his future reign is going to look like, and the book kind of touches on that later on. But I'm glad that Scobie is really pointing to this idea that William is really who we should be looking at to see where this endgame is going to shake out. How Charles plays the game right now as the current monarch really doesn't have a lot of weight into whether or not the monarchy will survive. William has a lot more power in that sense. But because of this knowledge that William is the future, Scobie notes that this is causing a lot of tensions within the institution. Quote, "This brewing power struggle between the favored prince and the unpopular king is Shakespearean. Scheming and backstabbing began long ago." Now you might be thinking, the monarchy and the royal family is meant to present a cohesive unit. Unity, strength, better together. If you want to go for the royal family and what they're meant to represent as symbols of like good family values, they're meant to show a model idealized family. But as Scobie points out here, it's not that kind of family. It's a lot of backstabbing. And as it becomes more of a game between Charles and William, that's going to become more and more the tensions as we move into the future. We know how this backstabbing comes about. We've talked multiple times on this channel about leaking stories, planting stories, collaborating with the media to spin certain narratives that benefit certain members of the family over other members. Scobie uses the example of Charles using Harry's drug-addled past to construct a great, loving, supportive father narrative to keep the press happy with these salacious articles and gossip about Harry, while also getting positive coverage for Charles, for example. But now that Harry and Meghan are out of the family as working royals, the butting of heads between Charles and William is going to become more and more apparent, and Scobie gives more examples of this, but I think this is a good way of showing that the family is starting to become more and more cutthroat, more and more split off, more and more divided, especially based on how they've shifted in their media tactics from like the 90s onwards. And with William and Harry growing up as media personalities as children, which I've also talked to death on this channel. The prologue also mentions another important claim of the book, which is to criticize the royal family and the institution's use of patriotism in its messaging, which can, if unchecked, turn to some very dark places. Scobie writes, "Recent years have seen an institution scrambling to justify its significance to younger generations who believe it no longer serves a strong enough purpose to justify its growing cost to the state. To stay relevant, the system, in an almost Trumpian twist, leans on patriotism, even jingoism, to shore up its purpose. When in doubt, festoon the palace, unfurl the Union Jacks, and enlist the tabloids." I like that Scobie also mentions that this jingoism and patriotism is kind of being used to get young people on board, because what's kind of unique and interesting about the modern times that we live in is that there is a lot of right-wing, alt-right media that is geared towards a younger audience, especially in the online sphere. We tend to think of younger people as more progressive, more liberal, more left-leaning, but in our modern media ecosystem, there is a lot of media catering to younger and younger people that is far right, not just conservative, but far right leaning, that plays on racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, misogyny, and especially ultra nationalism, ultra patriotism, even white nationalism, white identitarians, so to speak. So I think it's important for Scobie to note that even though it may seem counterintuitive, this is seemingly a tactic that the royal family is using to court a younger demographic, which is kind of scary because in the same way that there's a lot of young alt-righters in America that cause a lot of problems in terms of stochastic terrorism, hate crimes, etc., the royal family is kind of taking something out of the Trumpian playbook, out of the alt-right pipeline, in a way. And that's terrifying. That's a really scary thesis for the book to have. I think it's true, but it's kind of terrifying. It's something that I had talked about a lot on this channel. I assumed that this might be the case. Even just seeing how, I get crazy comments on my channels that can lean into this jingoistic territory. Like I said, it makes me feel like I'm less crazy for noticing this, because especially online, if unchecked and if the royal family really does want to go down the Trumpian route, there's a lot of damage that could be done in the online discourse, and already has to a certain extent on the royal family. Which is why I personally, with my channels, for example, want to take back that narrative from these crazy alt-righters, almost Trumpian, monarchist, royalist supporters. Because if they maintain control of this space, holy crap, it could go really badly. In the same way that when YouTube first started and it got taken over by a bunch of alt-right channels and there was no leftist discussions on YouTube for a while, it radicalized a lot of young people, especially young men. If the online space of royal commentary is left unchecked, it could radicalize a lot of people, especially maybe young women, for example. So this was definitely the first part of the book where I was like, yes! I've been right about this the whole time. The prologue ends in such a perfect way possible. Scobie says, quote, "Parts of this book will burn my bridges for good, but to tell the full story, there's no holding back. Not anymore. We're in the Endgame." I love this ending because I think Endgame and Scobie are really playing the first move of the Endgame with this book. If the monarchy is teetering on the possibility of a collapse, or at least losing a lot of trust in the British public, then throwing your cards on the table, showing your hand, leaving it all out there is probably the best move, because it ensures that the royal family can't play the same endgame that they've been trying to play for the last couple of years. They've been trying their damnedest to put out terrible negative stories about Harry and Meghan to try to squash any sort of criticism of the monarchy. They've sent all their little commentary minions out there to write pieces to puff themselves up, to try to denigrate anybody, even Omid, who's just another royal biographer, trying to denigrate anybody that raises any sort of critiques or criticisms of the monarchy as a whole. So I like that Scobie is essentially saying, we're in the endgame now. Anybody here that doesn't want these people to fucking win, they don't want these people to just backstab their way to the top and hoard billions and billions of pounds of money, we can play a strategic endgame against this family. Don't let them win the endgame, right? We're in the endgame now. Our choices, if we make a lot of strategic moves to get out ahead of where the endgame for the royal family is going, the things that they want to play in the endgame, if we can get out ahead of them, we can massively shift what the endgame is going to look like. Love that. Chapter 1, The Queen and Her Piper. Now, I'm gonna skip most of this chapter, honestly. I'm not a big Queen stan. She was cool, but it's not that interesting, honestly, to me personally. I think Scobie did a great job by framing the queen with her relationship with this piper. I think it's a great way of showing the queen's character. She was born into this role. She was groomed for this role as queen. She did that role. She made herself essentially from birth a blank slate for the country to project onto her whatever they wanted. But by bringing the story of the piper into this chapter, I think it also shows that the queen also had a humanity and a heart and soul to her that is maybe missing in some of the other players now that are left over now that the queen has passed. In the chapter, Scobie uses the example of the queen ensuring that the piper's job would be protected going forward even after her death, and how she also allowed him to take leave when his wife was dying of cancer. I think Scobie illustrates well that the queen was so good at her role, not just because she adhered to all the duty and protocol, but also because she still had a human heart. Like, there was still a human being inside there. There was already still some humanity in the queen that made her a likable person. She wasn't ruling over everyone with an iron fist. She earned people's trust and respect by having a solid soul within there. Yes, she also focused on her duty and being prim and proper and doing everything that she was supposed to be doing. But I think that that little glimmer of humanity is really what separates the queen from other members of her family. Charles, Camilla, William, Kate. It's not enough to perform the duties and hold on to tradition, whatever. You need someone that people honestly, genuinely love and respect. And the only way you're gonna get genuine love and respect is having a good personality, which the queen had. One section from this chapter that I thought was really interesting was after the queen passed away, he says, quote, "Each family member was given time alone with the queen as she rested in peace. A final moment in private before the world, which was informed of the sovereign's passing at 6:10 p.m., was invited to join the royal family in grief. That night, the group was split in two, with Charles, now king, and Camilla, queen consort, leaving for Burke Hall with William, now next in line for a dinner together, a top of the hierarchy gathering of sorts. Meanwhile, Andrew, Edward, Sophie, Anne, and Harry sat down for dinner together at Balmoral." I find this very interesting. I knew this already. Harry mentions it in Spare at the end, but I like that Scobie highlights that this is a gathering of the top of the hierarchy. It's all about power. Even in this moment of grief, the people who have the power or are soon to have the power are in one camp. The people who don't have the power within the family are in another camp. And I think for us, looking inwards, this seems so bizarre and so callous that a family behaves in this way. That they don't get together in the final moments after the queen passes to commiserate together, to grieve together. No. It's about the people that have power. They get together and chat and talk and go through that grieving process together and think about where the monarchy is going to go from here on out, what it's going to look like, because they have the power and it's their birthright, it's their inheritance coming down the pipeline. For everyone else, tough luck. You can go grieve with the other have-nots in the family. We don't care. If we're at the top of the hierarchy, we're not here to help you commiserate, live in your grief, grieve together. No. We're here to show you that after the queen's passing, you have no power. It makes it a very cutthroat and kind of like sadistic and cruel and horrible family dynamic, family system, which is odd when the royal family is meant to be the model family for the nation. Another point that Scobie really emphasizes in this chapter about the queen is that her long reign went a long way to ingratiate herself with the public, just being a constant fixture for 70 years, she didn't really have to do very much. Just being there for so long went a long way in projecting her as this woman that carried out her duties nobly and faithfully. Scobie specifically quotes Reverend Dr. Ian Greenshield, who said during the processional of the Queen's coffin, quote, "Most of us cannot recall a time when she was not our monarch." And I think that that is the crux of why we think of the Queen as a good queen. She didn't really do anything. She didn't really say anything. People didn't really know her other than like in her immediate circle. She had a personality. She seemed quite kind and lovely. She wasn't really anything where we could say, wow, there's a great leader. It mostly boils down to the fact that most people cannot remember a time before her. And that's it. So for most people, when they think monarchy, they think old lady that sits around wearing bright, colorful dresses, looking kind of stern, just looking like poised, well put together, having a bunch of corgi dogs. And that, in a way, for the monarchy is a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing for the monarchical institution in that that is exactly what they want to project. Somebody completely inoffensive, apolitical, nice old lady, no baggage. But it's a curse in that it is not what the monarchy really is, which is, it is literally a part of the British government. The British public as subjects of the crown, and everything that ties the British mythos together. So moving from the Queen to Charles, who does not imbue any of those qualities that people automatically associate with the monarchy if they have not studied any goddamn history. Moving into this new era is a big shift for the public, especially for somebody that is not just sitting still and looking pretty, who wants to modernize, who wants to have certain causes, stand up for something, be a leader, not just a figurehead. Which brings us to chapter 2. Shaky ground. The Queen is dead, the monarchy faces trouble. This chapter opens on an excellent quote from Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution. It's so funny, they never talk about the British Constitution in any of the royal commentary that I read, even though you would think that would be a big part of the politics of the royal family, their relationship to the Constitution, their constitutional duties, but no, let's just talk about what the hell Kate Middleton's wearing. But the quote is, "Above all things, our royalty is to be reverenced, and if you begin to poke about it, you cannot reverence it. Its mystery is its life. We must not let in daylight upon magic." Again, coming back to that theme of the power of the monarchy is an alchemy in which we conjure up magic, and this magic leads us to believe in the good of the monarchy against the reality, the actual facts of the situation where the monarchy is bad actually, because hello, of course the monarchy is bad. Of course we're wrong to believe that some person is been divinely appointed by God to lord over like a third of the world's population. Hello? Like, obviously. Like, do I really have to sit here and argue why the monarchy is bad? Like, come on. But I love, again, bringing this quote back to the magic. Once you start poking around in there and you see the actual truth of what the monarchy is, it's going to lose its magic. If it loses its magic, it loses its power. The chapter starts off with Scobie talking about something that constantly comes up in royal biographies, which is that for a long time, and Charles has had a long time to prep and get out his message about what he wanted his reign to look like. And believe me, he has. I've read a lot of biographers that are clearly parroting his talking points about what he wants his reign to look like. And Omid Scobie puts them in the book here, where he says, knowing full well how difficult it is to get an oversized, slow-moving institution to adapt, Charles has long championed a slimmed-down monarchy, one that is more modern, agile, and, more importantly for a public that helps foot the royal bill, cost-effective. More than just trimming the fat, the king, who as the Prince of Wales was known for his compassionate activism and progressive thinking, even if some of it resulted in his reputation as a busybody, had stressed to aides that he wants his version of a modern monarchy to be more palatable to younger generations. I've always found Charles's understanding or his interpretation of modern monarchy to be confusing, but also kind of make a lot of sense from Charles's perspective. Charles' slimmed down monarchy is something that on the surface, I think a lot of people, if they didn't rub their two brain cells together, maybe makes a lot of sense. But if you just think about it for like 2 more seconds, you might think, wait a minute, doesn't that just mean that fewer people in the family get to hoard all the money? And you'd be right, my friend. So if you hear the idea of a slimmed down monarchy, it might conjure up this idea of a shrewd CEO coming into a business to remove redundancies, to maybe give certain people more job responsibilities and duties so that you can lay off certain people in certain parts and yet still keep the business functioning. But when we talk about the royal family, the idea of a slimmed down monarchy doesn't really make sense for a whole lot of reasons. When we are dealing with how much the royal family actually costs the taxpayers, most of that doesn't really come down to how many people are within the institution, how many working royals there are, how many of them live in how many of their houses. All of that is hoarded wealth. Most of that has to do with assets that the royal family already has. There is some cost in the upkeep of these certain places, renovations, keeping the lights on, staffing these places. Sure, there's a cost to some of that, but a lot of what the monarchy has is hoarded, already previously acquired wealth. So even if you remove certain members of the family, it doesn't really remove how much they cost the taxpayer, so to speak. In that every time the royal family continues to hoard wealth, tax-free through inheritance or any bills that are passed for renovations on royal properties, whatnot, the fact that that income is not taxed in the way that it would be for anyone else in the world, that's where the taxpayers are losing out the most, because those taxes are what would help benefit the taxpayer. It's not about how much money the taxpayer is actually giving to the royal family. I've heard this notion that it's like £1.70 or something. Oh, it's just like costs like a cup of coffee to support the royal family. That's like totally the wrong way to think about this. The royal family doesn't work in the same way as a business. It's the fact that they don't pay taxes in the same way that us mere mortals do that is the true cost to the taxpayer, in that there is billions and billions of untaxed wealth that could be taxed to benefit the majority of British people. So I've always found this idea of like, well, if we cut down the amount of estates that, working royals live in, if we downsize them so they have less staff, if we don't have to split the amount of money that the royals get amongst a larger pool of working royals, that this is somehow some benefit to the taxpayer, makes literally just no sense to me whatsoever. It always frustrates me because nobody calls out that it doesn't matter at all. And in fact, under a system with a slimmed down monarchy, you're just having that inherited wealth passed on to a smaller and smaller group of people, split amongst fewer and fewer staff members. So none of it seems cost effective. It's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the royal family operates, but Charles wants to display it as if it's the same as being the CEO of a business. It's not. There are so many other things that are not factored in because they're not a regular business. They are the underpinning of the British government and therefore get away with a bunch of shit that nobody else gets away with. Scobie also discusses the controversy that happened near the end of 2022 with Lady Susan Hussey and Ngozi Fulani. Brief synopsis of the controversy: Ngozi Fulani called out Lady Susan Hussey, who was at a royal family event, for being racist, pestering her and badgering her, asking her where she was from. No, where are you really from? We know what that means. And Scobie includes a quote from Ngozi Fulani where she said, quote, "Standing there in a room packed with people while this violation was taking place was so strange, especially as the event was about violence against women. That feeling of not knowing what to do will never leave me. Almost alone in a room full of advocates." I think Scobie highlights very well with the Lady Susan Hussey controversy. It's not just about how awful this was of an experience for Ngozi Fulani. It's really about the tension between what the royal family wants to project in the quest for being a modern monarchy and the baggage that they do not want to let go of, and in some ways cannot let go of, because conservatism is part of the royal family's brand. It's kind of baked into the premise of being the monarchy. This is an event combating violence against women. And yet, when a harm like racism is perpetuated in this space, no one wants to do the right thing. Nobody wants to do the modern thing and call out racism and say, we don't tolerate that in this space. Instead, it's just pure silence because the family will not let go of the conservative baggage. Scobie writes, like so many at Buckingham Palace, she is from another era, and the mealy-mouthed excuses that rationalize this kind of behavior, well-meaning folks from that generation don't know any better, for example, do not cut it. Large, exasperated swaths of the public are weary of these justifications, and our current cancel culture is hostile to them. Now, I don't believe in cancel culture. I think cancel culture is a bit of a myth. I do believe in the power of large groups of people to, attack and do terrible things based on, outrage from the media or online. But in terms of, successful people losing their success, being hurt financially through cancel culture, no, I don't believe it happens. Obviously, this is a great example. The royal family got called out for this racist incident, but it doesn't seem to have hurt their pocketbook. But leaving that part aside, I think Scobie has a great point here, that this kind of behavior is really not going to be tolerated going into the future, especially as we get a younger and younger royal family coming into the fold. I think beforehand it was really easy to dismiss all of the sort of quirky racist things that Prince Philip said, or Charles, or the Queen Mother, because we just think, oh, they're super old. They're from a different generation. They're from a different era. And so it's an easy way to excuse it by just saying, well, they couldn't know any better. Now that we have more and more younger members coming into the family, William and Kate, for example, and then going into the future, obviously, with George, Charlotte, and Louis growing up, this is going to become more and more inexcusable because to us, of course, a 40-year-old man should know that racism is bad and has had plenty of opportunities to learn from other people that racism is bad and shouldn't be tolerated in your space. Scobie also notes the press offices in both royal households should be pumping out good news about the family, not countering allegations from their back foot and expending resources apologizing, fixing, and tap dancing around scandals, which is very insightful and also highlights that it's so bizarre that the royal family has so much power and yet somehow they never seem to hire good PR. They very rarely are successful these days at pumping out good press coverage. They're able to get some nice photo ops here and there and some puff pieces, but nothing that is truly getting the public's attention at all of the great work that they're doing. But instead, most of their press office's time is being on the back foot of scandals that are easily avoidable if they just planned and prepared and thought about how these things would come across to a broader demographic of people. Scobie notes in this chapter that they could have literally just not had Lady Susan Hussey there at all. William even makes a quip like, why is she even here? It's something that could have easily been avoided by not inviting her or preparing her not to be racist in public, but they're never that thoughtful. Continuing on the theme that the royal family doesn't really understand what it means to modernize or only wants to give the appearance of modernizing without changing things too drastically, Scobie gives the example of how Camilla tried to put out some sort of statement that she was not going to have ladies in waiting when she became queen. Instead, bringing on informal queen's companions. Though they would not be required to handle correspondence or administration like Queen Elizabeth II's right-hand women, these 6 would still be around to support her at official engagements. In other words, they're ladies in waiting with fewer duties. Hardly any different from the past. If you give people the same position and yet fewer responsibilities, it sounds like just more money, less work, which doesn't sound super modern. I think it's a very strange choice for Camilla to try to spin this idea as modernizing the monarchy. It again speaks to the family's inability to comprehend what a true modernization would look like. And they're surrounded by too many people that cannot see it from the outside. Scobie then goes on to talk a little bit more about the power struggles in the press coverage between William and Charles. He dangles a little bit of foreshadowing of chapter 6, which is about Prince Andrew, discussing how the press covered taking away Prince Andrew's titles and what seems to have really happened. Quote, palace aides told members of the press that Prince William and his father were in lockstep over the action to take away Andrew's titles and military honors, a buzzword that then rippled through the media, and one the palace used to suggest that Charles and his son were joining forces to support Queen Elizabeth II at the tail end of her reign. A nice story, but behind the scenes a different one played out. Knowing the Queen's soft spot for Andrew and his father's fear of hurting his brother, it was actually William who encouraged the Queen and Charles to strip the disgraced Duke of York. William stepped up, but those close to the Queen briefed journalists that it was very much a joint father-son move. That's where the term lockstep came in, said a source close to William. So what can we take away from this story? First, we see that maybe Prince William, maybe because he's younger or maybe because he's surrounded by different people, is at least somewhat aware of what the outside world might think. You would think it would not be hard to convince Charles and the Queen that Prince Andrew, who is facing allegations of being a predator, should maybe have some of his titles and honors revoked. But the second takeaway is iterated by Scobie right after. Quote, William is keen to ensure his own image is no longer impacted by poor decisions made by others, be it his father, his uncle, his brother, or any other family member. A little further down, quote, William's Kensington Palace and King Charles's Buckingham Palace are now hives of competing agendas and different ideas about how to modernize. Now, I wrote a little note to myself in the margins that says, why the power struggles when the hierarchy is already set. What I find very fascinating about the contradictions of monarchy is that on the surface, with a hereditary monarchy with primogeniture, you would think that there would be no need to set up these like different factions and different camps within the family. Because unlike in ancient times, nobody's gonna come with a sword usurp the throne. So why this need to live in different camps? Why couldn't Prince William, say, just sit back, not engage with the press at all? If his father messes up the messaging by like allowing his predator brother back into the fold, why does William have to do anything? Why not just sit back, relax for 20 odd years or however long Charles is going to live, and then take over the crown? That seems like the simplest solution. But I think, this is my pet theory, I think there's a little bit of an issue with that. I think the factions come from an even more existential fear that the monarchy won't exist by the time William becomes king if the Endgame doesn't play out the right way. If Charles and his team make blunder after blunder after blunder, gaffe after gaffe, corruption scandal after corruption scandal, there is a chance that the monarchy will become so unpopular that William will not get his birthright to be next in line to the throne. If not total dissolution of the monarchy, maybe significant reforms that will ultimately hurt William's birthright. I think if that's not the reasoning for why William is so protective of his image and trying to encourage people to hang on longer to get to his reign, not to listen to what's going on in the Charles era, the Carolean era, and instead to focus on his era and make sure that we get to that point in the monarchy. If that's not the reasoning for this, then I just do not understand at all. Another example of this tension comes with discussing environmental activism and how that's caused a rift between Charles and William. I found this to be an interesting parallel to a story that Prince Harry relates in Spare about how William seemed to be upset that Harry was taking on certain activism or certain causes that he wanted to make sort of like his signature. I believe the line in Spare is William saying, "Africa, elephants, that's mine," or something like that. That the family seems to be very competitive about being the one person doing this one type of activism. In an Endgame, the example that we get is with environmental activism. William, a couple years ago, decided that he wanted to launch a massive new award ceremony or prize called the Earthshot Prize. And it says after he announced this prize, quote, "Sources claimed Charles was quietly annoyed. For much of his adult life, he was the one who passionately pushed the environmental cause, often without any acknowledgement. He had hoped that William would want to involve his father, or at least credit him for inspiring him to take on this role, but instead, it was as if Charles's environmentalism didn't even exist." And I think in a lot of ways I understand why Charles would be pretty annoyed by this. In the same way that in Spare, Harry makes the point, well, actually, I think it was Harry's friends that made this point, but he agrees with them, that it's not like the family couldn't take on the same causes but do it together. If both William and Harry wanted to take on causes in Africa, they could do that together. In fact, it would be a great show of unity and strength. It also might have a sort of heartwarming angle where the PR can be about how you bond through this type of activism. Like if this source says here, like if William credited his newfound like love for environmental activism by saying that his father inspired him, he sees how hardworking Charles has been on this front, that could actually be a really heartwarming, uplifting story that would actually benefit the family as a whole. But I think there's so much anger and frustration there, a wanting to completely dismiss, distance everything that's going to happen in the Carolean era. It almost feels like once Charles's reign is no more, William is just trying to make himself into the new Charles but better, rather than celebrating his father, which is a very strange move. I think it just shows like how cold and emotionless the family really seems. And it seems like the overall outcome is worse PR, which is all they want in the first place, is good PR. So it's counterintuitive. It's just very strange. There is one entire paragraph that I wrote a note here I think is the perfect encapsulation of bad decisions compounding, because the firm can't see past appearances and maybe little blurbs in some articles. But if you zoom out to look at the big picture, the PR that ensues is almost like comically bad for the family. Quote, "As for the Earthshot ceremony, viewers were less than captivated, to say the least. In the United Kingdom, newspapers claimed the public switched off in droves within minutes of the BBC airing it, while the audience watching live in the United States via PBS's streaming platform fell to the hundreds at times. Despite certain celebrity guests flying into the green event at great expense and using thousands of gallons of jet fuel, Beckham flew on a private jet from Qatar. The environmental awards winners themselves were strangely forced to stay at home and appear via Zoom. Rather than buying a new outfit, Kate made a statement by renting her off-the-shoulder gown, a genuinely good idea, but one that has never been repeated at a royal event since. The green carpet the couple walked down at the start of the evening was repurposed from the previous year's ceremony, but the palace refused to comment on the fact it was shipped halfway across the world to make the environmentally conscious statement. As for local media coverage, it focused mostly on the cost of the trip for the city, $170,407, and how it would affect traffic. That is all we would care about in Boston. Having been to Boston many a time, that is the most important thing. How is this going to affect my commute? This paragraph really has everything in it, doesn't it? Little tiny breadcrumbs of the family wanting to pay lip service to these ideas of environmentalism, but essentially committing greenwashing along the way, reusing a carpet, but then having it shipped all the way over there and then refusing to comment on that. That sounds like greenwashing to me, claiming that something is greener than it actually is. It's so transparent, Kate reusing a dress or renting a dress and then never doing that ever again. It's like obvious pandering. The idea that the ceremony seemed to prioritize the celebrities that all flew in there on private jets as opposed to the people actually receiving the awards. Like, if these awards are to thank people for doing the actual amazing work to help protect our environment, why wouldn't they be invited in person? Like, are they worried about having to touch them? Like, it just makes it seem really elitist, makes it seem like it's more of a social function for celebrities. And on top of all that, it sounds like it was boring and no one wanted to watch it. So it's amazing how they tried to do so many tiny things to get good PR, to be able to put into articles, oh, we reused the carpet. Oh, Kate is wearing a rented dress. Oh, all of the awards winners are going to be at home, so they're not going to pay for the cost of the flights. All these little things that they try to do just so they can sneak those things into like some trashy tabloid articles. But then when you zoom out from the whole thing and you rub two brain cells together, you're like, wait a second, this whole thing is trash. I think it just goes to show that in some ways, William and Kate's team, by trying to like want to distance themselves from the rest of the press offices and try to do things in their own way and try to like steal bits and pieces from more successful royal family members. You know, Kate taking some like sort of Meghan inspiration for the outfits, William taking like the environmentalism thing from his father, trying to like cobble together a sort of like more modern image of the monarchy. They're actually like still so far behind the times and so unaware of what the bigger picture will look like, and how this just makes them look comically bad and their PR teams look comically bad. And nothing coming out of the royal family PR-wise seems cohesive. Scobie then transitions on to talking about the Commonwealth, which for a chapter entitled Shaky Ground makes a lot of sense because the Commonwealth is collapsing and it is one of the major things that is sort of touted as Queen Elizabeth's claim to fame, so to speak. A sign of her duty to the nation was her love of the Commonwealth, keeping the Commonwealth together. But obviously in our modern era, whether or not the Commonwealth wants to remain is really up in the air. Scobie goes on to highlight some of the many ways that the royal family has screwed up in trying to modernize. Well, they barely even tried to modernize their PR and press within the Commonwealth, and not just back home in Britain. Scobie opens by talking about William and Kate's disastrous Caribbean tour through Jamaica, Belize, and the Bahamas. There were anti-royal protesters there immediately. Now, you would think if you were the royal family's PR team, you would probably see this coming, considering all the new conversations that have been had in the past couple decades or so about the legacy of colonialism, but for some reason, they didn't think too much about it when planning this trip. Before William and Kate even arrived, they removed the village where all these protesters were gathered to protest William's charity that had been involved in a contested property dispute with the locals. But even when they removed that one village, they still landed in more protests. And 100 people had written an open letter that said, quote, "During her 70 years on the throne, your grandmother has done nothing to redress and atone for the suffering of our ancestors that took place during her reign and or during the entire period of British trafficking of Africans, enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. We encourage you to act accordingly and just say you're sorry." And I noted here that, to me, this is a great example of how the royal family, and maybe Britain as a whole, is totally out of step with the world's cries when it comes to colonialism. The way that this trip planned out is as if objections to the royal family on political grounds totally blindsided them. They were not expecting any sort of pushback to them in a world that is waking up and realizing the horrors and atrocities committed under colonialism. And I think that speaks to a giant bubble, a giant gap in knowledge about what happened under colonialism. And this open letter does call out the Queen, which I think is fair, because she did not do anything to redress these issues. And there has yet to be a formal apology from the royal family or the British government for these atrocities. But it's also a call out of the royal family going on into the future. This is specifically talking to Prince William, your grandmother. Your grandmother didn't do this. And so the question is, William, will you apologize for and engage with the history of colonialism? And based on how this trip played out, the answer is no, absolutely not. And so I think that that's a point in favor of the Endgame being a loss for the family, because this is the one issue that they are terrible at managing from a brand perspective even. They're gonna go down on this ship looking like a bunch of pith helmet wearing colonizers, a bunch of racists. They're gonna lose the entire Commonwealth if they don't play this out right. And they're gonna have to go back to the British people with their tail between their legs when ignorant British people finally wake up to the fact that there is no British Empire anymore, and they're just living in an authoritarian nightmare. And that'll be the end. So I think that it's interesting. I think this is one of the biggest things that I think is going to be a big part of the monarchy endgame, so to speak, or the Windsor family endgame. They're just so bad at understanding what is to be expected from them from outside the weird British media bubble. Not only are their optics very bad, the royal family also tried to throw the Jamaican government under the bus for their bad optics and PR strategies. Scobie notes, quote, "No one found the staging of the pair standing in an old Land Rover to recreate imagery of colonial-era trips made by the Queen and Prince Philip a bad idea. The move, which saw the couple in all white on a raised platform waving at the all-black crowds below, was greeted with horror and widely mocked. Only after the world reacted to the photos did those around the couple attempt to distance themselves from the decision. There were questions, including from William, about whether it was appropriate," admitted a Kensington Palace source. "The staging was all at the request of the Jamaican government, not the palace. They were keen to include the Land Rover, which had been kept for moments like this, but absolutely we should have pushed back." Curiously, a spokesperson at the office of the Prime Minister of Jamaica said this version of the story did not ring true. How fucking wild do you have to be to try and claim that the Jamaican government tried to make you look like you were a bunch of colonizers? Really, the government of Jamaica set you up to make you look that bad. Did they also tell you to wear all white? Like, come on, this is such a cop-out. Another bizarre PR gaffe, he decided to wear orange and white to their meeting with the Prime Minister of Jamaica. And orange and white were the colors of the People's National Party, which was the party in opposition to the Prime Minister. But even more bizarrely than that, because when I first read that, I was like, is that because the opposition party is more conservative and they're trying to like dog whistle? But no, even stupider, actually it is a more leftist party than the party of Andrew Holness, the Prime Minister. So very bizarre messaging. Like, the royal family spends an inordinate amount of time planning how to convey messages through their wardrobe. So to bungle that message is so amazing to me. Totally shocking how stupid that was. And then they just had to sit there and listen while the Prime Minister basically told them that Jamaica's probably gonna move on from the royal family. And that's gotta be fucking hilarious. I want to see the video of that.
Jamaica is, as you would see, a country that is very proud of our history, very proud of what we have achieved, and we're moving on. And we intend to attain in short order our development goals and fulfill our true ambitions as an independent, developed, prosperous country.
But even with the myriad of ways that the royal family is terrible at PR, despite it being like their entire lives, even when they bungle the PR that badly, they still have the audacity to start briefing to the press how they always want to do things their way. This is something that I think William has gotten from Charles, to try to spin your irrationality and stubbornness into a positive in the media. Scobie gives the example of Jean-Christophe Gray briefing lines to the press about, quote, "Moving forward," he said, "the heir and his wife planned to do things the Cambridge way," which included abandoning the never complain, never explain motto favored by his father and grandmother. Aides also shared details about William's own plans to modernize how he works when he succeeds his father as the Prince of Wales. From the outset, it claimed he would have the estimated 137 staff Charles employed to create a more cost-effective and less formal team. It is not a criticism of how it was done in the past. I mean, it is inherently a criticism, that's just dumb. A Kensington Palace aide told The Sun, which also reported that William wanted to rip up the royal institution's rulebook. But times are changing. To me, it speaks of extreme hubris that even when they have the protection of like their whole family and a bunch of other PR teams, William and Kate still seem to believe that they're the ones doing it the best and are willing to basically throw everybody else under the bus by claiming that they're going to get rid of all of these things that Charles or the Queen are holding on to. But when have they ever demonstrated that they're doing this whole PR thing better than Charles or the Queen? Like, barely. The bar is so low in that regard. But even still, like, based on their reactions to this tour, like, unlikely they're gonna do a better job. I love that he claimed that he was gonna scale down the staff. Again, just hoarding wealth. It just means fewer people have more job responsibilities and you don't have to pay as many people and you get to keep all that wealth. I don't know. What am I supposed to take from this? Like, you're basically promising company layoffs in the future. Like, yay, that gets me super excited for the monarchy. I feel kind of bad for all those people that think that their jobs might be in jeopardy. Scobie then goes on to talk about Spare, which again is another spanner in the works for how is this endgame going to play out. Because the most obvious choice of like reconciling and trying to bring the family together seems to be off the table based on what Scobie is interpreting, but I think is another example of the shaky ground going into the endgame. Curiously, I like that Scobie seems to give a personal witness in the book that corroborates Harry and Meghan's most fundamental claim about planting and briefing and leaking stories. Quote, "The responses to claims by Harry and Meghan have followed a pattern of avoidance and dissembling. I've repeatedly witnessed up close how palace aides do their best to muddy the truths the couple shared with the world, be it with misleading briefings to newspapers or in some cases, lies to inquiring journalists. But the issues they raised, from the institutional cruelty to unconscious racial bias, still loom large over the monarchy. None of this was helped by the fact that the Sussexes remain as much of the royal story today as the day they stepped back from their roles. For most royal correspondents, the couple are still the only surefire way to get prominent headlines and online traffic. Whether it was the months of will they won't they stories about the couple attending the coronation, or the breathless running commentary about the state of their various business deals in the United States. And that is a really key part of the story as well, is that the family has ultimately shot themselves in the foot with their handling of the Harry and Meghan issue. Harry and Meghan are just too popular, too important for SEO, too much drama. The family wants to defeat Harry and Meghan by basically briefing the most nasty, horrible things about them, trying to get the public to just hate them irrationally. But overall, what they're doing is not going to help them get good, solid PR for the family. Instead, they're incentivizing journalists to continue to follow the Harry and Meghan saga, to use the tension of the family against Harry and Meghan to release more and more clickbaity stories, more and more engagement on their news platforms, on their tabloid platforms. But a lot of this is just distracting from what the family really needs, which is just good PR. And they're just so sucked into all of the nightmarish scenarios here created by the press and probably egged on by the negativity that they themselves consume when they read the tabloids, because we know from plenty of other sources, including Harry, that the royal family reads these tabloids every single day. And so they consume that garbage. And so that's just fueling their own hate in their brain. If they actually engaged in it on a logical PR level, which would be conciliatory, try to bring the family together somehow, make concessions, try to get Harry and Meghan back on their side in some capacity because they are very popular and are just shinier and more engaging than other members of the family, overall, that would lead to a lot more positive PR than what they're getting right now, which is basically blunder after blunder, scandal after scandal, and putting out a bunch of small fires instead of just building something that people want to continue to invest their taxpayer funds into. However, spite and jealousy is a powerful drug. Scobie notes, around significant birthdays, palace aides are often eager to quietly provide one or two outlets with access to a select group of sources for quotes and background information to use in puff pieces celebrating the life and work of that royal. Something that if you read a lot of them, you can tell. Scobie gives the example that when Kate turned 30 in 2012, quote, I was pleasantly surprised at how only 18 months into my time covering the young royals, Kensington Palace officials happily assisted me with exclusive details as I put together a special issue for Us Weekly. Also corroborates what Harry mentions in Spare about how the palace encouraged him and Meghan to leak details about their wedding to drum up interest in the big spectacle. But in 2022, for William's birthday, instead of a chance to get good, solid PR, spite and jealousy gets the best of William, who uses this as an opportunity to leak quotes about how pissed off he is at his brother. Quote, instead of hearing more about William's ambitious environmental plans, we were told in detail by royal sources that he, quote, alternates between grief and anger over Harry's life decisions and feels his brother, quote, has 100% crossed a line by speaking publicly about his struggles within the family. And rather than share how William was preparing for his role as the Prince of Wales and taking over the Duchy of Cornwall, we heard from people close to him about how Harry has been, quote, sucked into an alien world in California, and there's fuck all William can do about it. Still, opined one close friend, quote, William is absolutely allergic to drama, before proceeding to air his grievances about Meghan. Could have fooled me. Yet again, how are they so bad at good PR? They are so stuck in their own emotions that they cannot actually save the monarchy. William wants to prop up the idea of his reign, right? We see that all the time when it comes to Charles, that he wants to undermine Charles and talk about how his reign is going to be so much better. But then on his birthday, the perfect opportunity to talk about what William is going to do for the monarchy in the future, what kind of amazing, wonderful soul we're gonna get as our next monarch, all these great plans, what the William era is gonna look like. No, we don't get any of all that. We get petty drama, petty bullshit, the anger and hatred and frustration that William has towards Harry that he should just totally ignore because Harry is not a threat to him in any way. Harry cannot usurp the throne. Harry cannot take down the monarchy. William could literally pay it no mind whatsoever and focus on getting people excited in him as a person. But he's not an exciting person. He's just a petty and spiteful person who has inherited the terrible Windsor gene of wanting the spotlight to be on you 24/7 for no reason other than the fact that you were born to be watched. Scobie notes that this is, quote, one of the many events that highlight William's metamorphosis into what some have described as a hot-headed company man, an institutional champion who's privately embraced the draconian tactics of an antiquated and often vicious institution, an air increasingly comfortable with the palace's dirty tricks and the courtiers who dream them up. And Scobie highlights that this shadowy web of courtiers is probably the biggest problem that the institution has. Quote, with ties to the government and the shadow players who hold the reins of power, these men, and sometimes women, though there are still very few in senior roles, are often the operators, strategists, and family confidants running the show and managing the royal brand behind palace walls. So Scobie hypothesizes that most of the time, a lot of the problems that come from the PR and the bad strategies of the family members comes from these courtiers, these men in gray suits, who are very good at backstabbing and playing dirty tricks, but in a lot of ways are so privileged and out of touch that their backstabbing makes literally no sense from an outsider's perspective. And the dirty tricks that they try to play ultimately backfire in terms of the optics to the rest of the sane world. Scobie writes, quote, time and time again, the institutional operatives have demonstrated that they are incapable of managing the scandals that the family routinely throw their way. From the Diana debacle of the 1990s to Andrew's litany of disgraces and the current family feuds, the institutional operators rarely get in front of anything. They often find themselves in a scramble to fix and cover up, and then roll out shoddy PR techniques that stop way short of solving the problem. These over-rehearsed, lacking responses prove there is no learned wisdom. They make the same mistakes over and over again. The problem with such a conservative institution like the royal family, like the monarchy, is that conservatism is by nature backward looking. It is a belief that the past, tradition, things that have come prior are like morally superior or better or trump anything that could come from a progressive mindset. So if everybody involved in the institution is constantly backward thinking, constantly thinking about how they've done things in the past, how they've responded to controversies in the past, and trying to do the same things over and over and over again, they are never going to respond to modern problems, modern criticisms in a way that's going to be sufficient for the majority of the public, other than the most conservative or reactionary base. Which is a little bit scary, because if the royal family maybe one day wakes up and realizes that they've alienated the majority of the population because they're unable to use sufficiently decent PR strategies to puff themselves up, then their core demographic, their core fan base is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, but probably more reactionary. And in that ways, it's kind of a scary Trumpian logic, right? You're gonna start to become a cult pretty soon. Anybody that thinks outside of the box is gonna be outcast. Anybody that isn't a yes man, anybody that wants to engage in something different, it's always going to be a struggle, it's always going to be a hurdle, and it's going to disincentivize any modernization and progress. And yet this whole main objective of the royal family is to modernize. But it's just so antithetical to the very core of their being. Scobie also has this hilarious part where he talks about how the royal family tried to replace Harry and Meghan in the sort of family lineup by using Edward and Sophie, but they are basically a joke and nobody cares about them at all. He specifically highlights Sophie saying, "Oprah who?" Scobie, of course, writes, quote, "The comments about the world's most successful black woman and one of the biggest faces in entertainment made them seem stuffy or tin-eared at best and casually bigoted at worst." If that doesn't summarize the royal family's problem, I don't know what does. And to top it all off, the royal family is spending more money than ever before. So not only does the royal family insult the intelligence of pretty much everybody in the universe with their bad PR, they then have the audacity to cost people more money. After all of this chat about wanting to like slim down, make a more cost-effective monarchy, they just keep spending it. In late June 2023, the Sovereign Grant Report, an annual document that outlines the royal family's expenditures, revealed that spending had risen by 5% from the previous year to £107.5 million, the second time in history it had broken the £100 million mark. Despite Charles campaigning on environmental issues, reports from 2002 and 2003 also revealed that he still regularly travels by helicopter between his numerous royal residences at an average cost of £15,000 per flight. William and Kate's ill-fated Caribbean tour cost £226,000 in flights and accommodation alone. For British taxpayers still in the middle of a cost of living crisis, the news was once again a tough pill to swallow. But they don't care. They don't care, and that's the weird thing about it. They're trying so desperately to keep the monarchy together, but they're failing to comprehend the basic problem with the monarchy, which is that it is a real manifestation of the class system. So the one way to make sure that the monarchy remains intact is to make sure that the gap between the rich and the poor doesn't create like an angry underclass. They focus so much on all the PR trickery, but then don't even focus on the basic problem, which is that at a certain point, people are going to ask, aren't these people spending too much money? Don't these people have too much money? And so many people don't have a place to live, don't have food on their table, can't afford basic necessities, can't heat their homes in the winter. And those basic philosophical questions are what brings the monarchy down. There's no magic that you can put on that to make people want to celebrate a bunch of rich people when they can't eat, when they can't survive. The chapter ends, and I think this is a really great way to end the chapter, by circling back to the Ngozi Fulani story. Yet another example of how the royal family tries to backpedal, to put out fires, to do damage control in their PR, but yet still totally misses the mark because they cannot see the forest for the trees. So how did the monarchy fuck up the Ngozi Fulani story? They wait 17 days to invite Fulani back to Buckingham Palace, which presumably shows that they really did not care about this scandal at all until the PR got so bad that they felt that they had to respond, which is not where you want to be from a PR standpoint, where people are thinking that the only reason that you want to respond is because you look bad. Just get ahead of it. They could have easily gotten ahead of this and put out a statement apologizing immediately. That would have been great PR. But because it has to do with race and they have a bunch of racists in their base, they didn't want to do that. They then released this photo of Ngozi Fulani and Lady Susan Hussey reuniting, which makes it look like Fulani is a fucking hostage. They then put out a statement that says, "The meeting was filled with warmth and understanding. Lady Susan offered her sincere apologies for the comments that were made and the distress they caused to Miss Fulani. Miss Fulani has accepted this apology and appreciates that no malice was intended." Why they would say this when there was another party in the room that could easily disprove that this happened is another bizarre thing. They thought they could get away with this lie. Because then Ngozi Fulani states that she never received a direct apology from the institution. Absolutely bizarre. Again, it's not that hard to say sorry in person. She was right there. And it also is just so bizarre that they would want to lie and claim that an apology was given when it wasn't. Why not just give the apology and say that you apologized for it? It seems all backwards. It would have cost them literally nothing to say sorry to Ms. Fulani. How they were able to mess this up, I have no idea. It really seems like the bigotry and racism is so strong that they are incapable of saying sorry to this woman because they're worried that it's going to alienate them from other racists, which is, again, bad strategy, and it causes way too many questions. It makes us, the reader, question the motives of the palace way more than if they had just done the normal sane PR move. And then to top it all off, on this really bad PR Sunday, well, back in the real world, Ngozi Fulani has to step down from working for this charity because of the amount of harassment and threats that she received just for exposing that the royal family is racist, which is like not even a surprise. Like, who is genuinely shocked that Lady Susan Hussey said something racist? Nobody. But Ngozi Fulani is getting harassed and bullied for telling the truth because people don't want to hear it, because people don't want to engage in their own racism. They want to put their heads in the sand. But in crazy royal fairyland, quote, Lady Susan returned to the royal fold, performing official duties on February 21st, attending a memorial service of a courtier on behalf of Princess Anne. In June, she was seen laughing and joking with Charles and Camilla in the monarch's box at Royal Ascot, firmly back in the royals' inner circle. And with that, we lead into Chapter 3. Oh God, I hate this. Time for a costume change. It's a new day. Chapter 3. Oh God, I hate this. King Charles premiere. Chapter 3 I find quite fascinating because Scobie kind of makes the argument that despite the fact that all of King Charles's life has been ruled by PR, wanting to have the best PR, trying to get a positive image in the press, in some ways, he's really bad at it. And a lot of that comes down to his stubbornness and irritability getting in the way of his own success. Scobie opens the chapter talking about one of King Charles's first public ceremonies as king, when he had to sign a castle visitors book and had a leaky pen that made him so visibly upset and annoyed. There was the new monarch publicly making a fuss over a triviality, bungling his special moment by flashing his temper during the official proceedings for his own ascension while signing his very first document as king. Hadn't the man had decades of training for this exact situation? I think that's a really interesting question. You would think that with how much Charles has prioritized PR and getting positive PR for himself, he seems to lack a large amount of self-awareness, and that his PR team is woefully behind the times with how these moments can spread and travel, especially in a new era of social media. It demonstrated that Charles and the institution still hadn't grasped the power of social media and the internet, a fact that frankly seems blindly incompetent at best. Not only are moments like this with Charles and the leaky pen bad from a social media profligation perspective, but also a woeful misunderstanding of the times. In a time where we truly believed in divine right or some sort of reasoning for the monarchy based in some mythology, the public might look past the personality flaws of the monarch. If Charles were King Henry VIII, maybe he could get away with just being irritable in public. But in a world where these things are captured on film, spread across the internet, and everybody can judge the character of this individual, it really shows that the PR teams are really not following modern best practices or even really comprehending the media landscape as it exists today. Scobie then goes on to discuss some of the tensions between King Charles and the conservative government. He starts with the example of Liz Truss formally requesting that King Charles not visit COP27, a climate change summit with various world leaders. As an environmental activist, King Charles has regularly attended these types of events, but the conservative government has taken the path of climate change, if not outright denial, at least indifference to the climate crisis. So even when Liz Truss left office in disgrace, Rishi Sunak still kept this request in place, which really frustrated Charles, who again just wants to do whatever the hell he wants. Whether it be good, like fighting for climate activism, or bad, like getting irritated over a leaky pen in public, like a petulant child. Another example given by Scobie is how the coronation was handled. Shortly after the Queen's passing, the palace was briefing news outlets that the British public could expect a slimmed down modern coronation, trying to assuage the public that this coronation was going to be value for money, especially during a huge cost of living crisis in the UK. But what's really intriguing, and I think it speaks to the Conservative Party as a whole, Scobie writes, quote, Sunak and his team pressured the palace to rethink Charles's vision for a toned-down, cost-saving coronation, sternly advising them to go big and put on a full show. Now, in my humble opinion, I think that the Conservative Party in the UK, similar to the Republican Party in the United States, don't get me wrong, has started to go down the path of being more and more right-wing, verging on fascism light. So what I think Sunak's government, by telling the royal family that they need to go big with the coronation, feeds into something that's pretty common in fascism, which is the aesthetics of fascism, the aesthetics of strength and power and might in traditionalism. Despite the fact that economically, fiscally, and even optically, a massive coronation might not be the best route for convincing the British public that the government and the monarchy are going to go in new modern directions, that they are sympathetic to the working peoples. Instead, it sounds like the government was trying to use the coronation as a type of bread and circuses distraction from a lot of the failures of the conservative government's rule. It kind of reminds me about that time when Donald Trump went to France and witnessed like this big military parade and wanted something like that in the United States. I think the government wanted this to be some sort of aesthetic symbol of a glorious Britain, of a strong empire, that despite all of the problems that have come from conservative policies of austerity, that the nation can still rely on this tradition of the royal family to unite us together, and everything that the royal family represents could be utilized for a political theater to distract from government failings. In a bizarre twist of events, it seems like King Charles was actually more thoughtful about the bad optics of a giant coronation during a cost of living crisis than the government. Scobie writes that it was a chance to demonstrate that he would be a more modern, compassionate monarch whose words about slimming down weren't just hot air, which in some ways shows the difference because the royal family is really focused on their domestic audience. It's kind of flipped in a way because the royal family claims to control 1/3 of the world's population through the Commonwealth, trying to project a sort of international legitimacy. And yet the royal family really only focuses on their popularity and PR within the United Kingdom. They don't really care if they get negative press within the Commonwealth. They get plenty of criticism outside of the UK, but they do not care. They only care if people within the UK criticize them. Whereas when the coronation comes in, the British government, which you would think should only care about the British people whom they are governing, instead they seemed to focus more on how it would appear on an international stage. Speaking on Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's thoughts about the coronation, Scobie writes, a source said it was the Queen's funeral that reminded Sunak and other ministers that a proper royal occasion draws an international audience like no other and puts a momentary gloss on reality. One thing the palace did understand, though, was that this would probably be one of the last giant royal spectacles for the upcoming decade or so. And we know through various other examples that that is where the royal family is at their most popular, is when they are appealing to that fairy tale spectacle of a royal wedding, jubilee celebrations, those types of events. But where everybody is in the family right now, we're not going to see a royal wedding for probably a few decades to come. But one other note that I think demonstrates that the conservative government doesn't really care how this plays to their domestic audience is that one spokesperson said, quote, obviously there will be a great deal of attention on the United Kingdom at that time. It will be a moment for us to show the best of Britain in many different aspects. That great deal of attention is from international audiences looking inward, not from the British people. To them, this was to display strength to the world, not to actually benefit the citizens of Great Britain, the British subjects, so to speak. Scobie diverts back to one of the original themes that Charles is really focused on getting positive publicity for himself and is really irritated when he doesn't get the press coverage that other members of the royal family get, which is funny because when the spotlight is entirely on him, like the Penn situation, he doesn't really show himself to be turning on the charm. He just seems to want to expect all of the press coverage simply for being the king, even though he doesn't have the personality to really catch the attention of the public. And this is highlighted through the end of 2022, discussing Harry and Meghan getting coverage for the Netflix documentary and for, at that time, Prince Harry's upcoming book, Spare, which, from King Charles's mind, overshadowed a lot of his first outings as king that he really wanted to use to, launch himself into the new Carolean era, to demonstrate how he was being more modern and hip. One of these publicity stunts is Charles donating some funds to a charity that donates surplus food to food banks. £1 million? That's pretty chump change when we're dealing with the royal family, but I guess he wanted a pat on the back. It's interesting as well, he didn't actually donate any food. The royals are very bad at actually donating food. They just don't know how food banks work. Another publicity stunt that got overshadowed by the Harry and Meghan situation was Charles and Camilla visiting Wrexham, which their teams thought was like super hip and modern because Wrexham has recently gained sort of newfound interest because Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney purchased the local Wrexham team and then created a documentary series showing that team history and them trying to make it in higher and higher league tables, blah, blah, blah. I'm not like a football historian, okay, so I don't know everything. But unfortunately, even though this would have been a pretty interesting, flashy event with these Hollywood celebs, the documentary overshadowed pretty much all of that. Scobie quotes the ever-presently hilarious headline from the Mirror that said, "Stop this royal circus." Of course, it is the royal circus that they are creating, but Scobie reiterates what pretty much all of us already knew, which was after the Netflix documentary was released, despite Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace remaining supposedly silent on the issue with no official statements, they were complaining and explaining to all of their favorite journalists within the royal rota to help spin their side of the narrative. Yet another example of Charles feeling like he was overshadowed by the whole Harry and Meghan circus created by the media was him visiting a Jewish community center in London around the holiday times as a way to promote his new ideas as monarch to be like welcoming to other faith and religious traditions. We've seen this with other royal engagements that King Charles has partaken in, and I think it's the monarchy's attempt to try to like step away from the Church of England, because I think they realize that that ship has fucking sailed at this point. Like, the amount of British people that identify as Christians, not even just Church of England, Anglican Christians, but just Christians in general, has fallen pretty dramatically. And the monarchy only really has like 3 things to really hitch their ride to: the Church of England, being commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and being the head of state. So I think it's pretty unsurprising to me that monarchs going forward want to distance themselves from being like defender of the faith or whatever, because there's just not enough people that are that super religious for that messaging to really work with a modern British audience. I also find interesting that Scobie specifically remarks that King Charles has never watched the Netflix documentary or read Harry's Spare, which to me is a little bit sad because the opening chapter of Spare is basically a plea for his father and brother to read it. How petty do you have to be to not read your own son's book? Like, no matter how much you disagree with it. I don't know, that really gets to me. Another example of really bad optics, again, despite the fact that Charles always wants to have good PR, he seems incapable of understanding what good PR is when he took back Frogmore Cottage from Harry and Meghan, which pretty much everybody saw as like a super petty and spiteful move. Even like pro-royalists or reporters that usually are sympathetic to the royals seemed to think that this was a super bad move optically to kick out Harry and Meghan from Frogmore and to give Frogmore Cottage to obvious predator Prince Andrew. This again shows how King Charles' policies moving towards a modern monarchy don't often make sense and don't actually take into consideration how it looks to a layperson, and that a layperson is not going to care if somehow this is meant to be more cost effective or cheaper for the monarchy. The reasoning for giving Prince Andrew Frogmore was, quote, Charles's way of reducing the number of non-working royals paying discounted rent for grand properties, but the timing and optics suggested this was also a punitive measure aimed at Harry and his family, one that smelled of bitterness and recrimination. It's an example of the PR missing the forest for the trees. Charles wanted to spin this removal of Frogmore Cottage as a cost-saving measure for the monarchy, a way to put good, hard-earning money back into taxpayers' wallets. But if him and his team zoomed out just a little bit from that decision, they might think evicting your son and then giving his house to a pedophile might not play the way that you expect it, regardless of how much money people are going to save out of it. Pretty much anything related to Prince Andrew is going to be contentious when the entire world is pretty sure that he is a predator. I watched the documentary Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich on Netflix, and I think that was a great documentary. But I mean, I've heard Virginia Giuffre's side of the story, and it's pretty compelling. I don't think that there's any going back from that, but just hold on, because we're about to get to the Prince Andrew chapter. Let's end this chapter on two interesting ways in which King Charles is playing politics in a way that should have people side-eyeing a little bit. One example given is Charles meeting with the president of the European Commission while Britain and the EU were negotiating a post-Brexit trade deal between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which is a very contentious issue in the British Isles as a whole. The Troubles is obviously like in living memory for many people. The idea that there could potentially be no free movement because Ireland still remained in the EU and the UK was not, made this a pretty tense issue. So for the king to be involved in this deal, and for this agreement to be entitled the Windsor Framework, is extremely curious after we've just had an entire chapter about how the royal family is unwilling to condemn racism, something that should be pretty uncontentious. But King Charles will happily wade into the waters of like the Ireland question, but then the monarchy doesn't want to wade into anything about colonialism or racism or homophobia or transphobia or anything that's a modern progressive issue. But no, they'll happily wade into things that are not apolitical, that actually have a lot of tensions on both sides of the political spectrum. But it's pretty telling what political issues the monarchy is willing to get involved with, and which they just throw their hands up and say, we're not allowed to do that. We have to be apolitical. Those choices that they make about labeling things as apolitical or political is political. Scobie also highlights something that I have noticed very frequently, which is kind of the problem of having this sort of figurehead, is that it makes it very easy for no one to actually own the decisions that the government and the royal family make together, because they're both part of the government. We saw in the last chapter how William and Kate's team tried to throw the Jamaican government under the bus, but they've only learned it from the best, because that's how the British government works too. The British government tries to throw the royal family under the bus, and the royal family tries to throw the British government under the bus, if there's any pushback to their decisions. With this Windsor Framework criticism, Scobie writes, quote, "Buckingham Palace told me the king was acting on government's advice, but Downing Street claimed it was the king's decision. Who's actually at fault here? I guess we'll never know." In a true democracy, there would not be this type of passing the buck off. When it comes to who authorized this deal to go on and who was invited to see this deal, at the end of the day, the leader of the executive branch is the one ultimately responsible. But in this wacky system, the government can claim it's the monarchy's responsibility, and the monarch can claim it's the government's responsibility. It's exactly the same issues that I have, for example, when it comes to the king or queen's opening of parliament speech. If things come up in the speech that people don't like, they get to say, well, you know, the monarch didn't write that speech. That's the government saying it. But what if the government gets pushback from it? They can easily claim, oh, no. The monarch really wanted to put that part in the speech. It's just an easy way for people at the top to avoid responsibility. And these powers remain unchecked. And we'll never know who's responsible for it, because it's in neither party's interest to really clear up who was the final decision maker. But we end on something that is kind of freaky to me, which is that the German government seems to really like Charles as the new monarch. Now, the royal family are German by heritage, as with pretty much all royal families in Europe. But I was kind of taken aback that Germany would welcome King Charles with such high honors. He was greeted with military honors when he arrived, which Scobie says, quote, was an unprecedented move that signaled Germany's strong support for the new king and the monarchy. They also invited Charles to speak in front of German parliament, where he started by discussing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which you would think would be political matters, wouldn't it? I'm not saying that King Charles is on the wrong side of that. I think that he's right that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is bad, actually. But it just shows that this whole, apolitical thing is just garbage. But I think this scene reminded me a lot of the speech that I covered where Charles was in Kenya on a state visit. And he kind of seems to follow the same template, try to speak in the local language for a bit. He spoke some German during this speech. Talk about the royal family's connections to the host country. Just talk up all the times that they've visited and all the cool things that they've done there. And yet it is curious that in the Kenyan speech, Charles seems basically incapable of condemning the acts of invaders into a foreign land. But in this case, he doesn't seem to have a problem with that. Seems pretty hypocritical, but, whatever. The chapter ends with what I think is a great summation of some of the problems with Charles and his early reign and what we've seen of it so far. It ends with a quote from the Queen to Harry that says, quote, "Your father always does what he wants to do." And then out of quotes, Scobie comments, "Charles has finally got his chance, and only he can squander it." And I think that's really the issues that I have with Charles. He is incredibly stubborn. Sometimes he's on the right track. Sometimes he's on the wrong track. Sometimes he's on the very, very wrong track. But there is nobody around to challenge Charles. The institution is designed in a way to encourage yes man type behavior. And Charles is not a fucking Abraham Lincoln type man to create a team of rivals and to really hash out different perspectives. He's stubborn. He clearly has a temper that he's willing to display in public. He doesn't want to compromise on anything. And he will not accept going a different route until his hands are literally tied. And that type of unchecked power is scary. It's terrifying. As much as you want to say, oh, he's just a figurehead, oh, the monarch has no power, it's still not a great look for Britain that their head of state is such a stubborn asshole who is incapable of finding good optics even when they hit him squarely on the nose. And just because he is a figurehead doesn't mean that he doesn't have power and influence in the messaging, especially when now he essentially has the duties of parroting conservative talking points to prop up the British government, which leads us to chapter 4. Remembrance of Things Past, the ongoing campaign to make the royals great again. Chapter 4 opens up on the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations. Obviously, Scobie describes the scene. I'm sure you can imagine what this giant spectacle of a Platinum Jubilee looks like. But the scene is punctuated by something said by Good Morning America's TJ Holmes, who said, "No one does pomp, circumstance, and all of this like the royals," motioning to all the festivities in the streets. Scobie himself even remarks, "There's an almost school reunion-like atmosphere at big royal occasions such as this. It's impossible not to get a little swept up in the spectacle of it all." And look, as someone that's been in the United Kingdom for 2 royal weddings, I can totally sympathize. I totally understand getting swept up in the fervor of it all, in all of the pageantry that comes with all of these royal celebrations. It's always fun for people to have a block party, get dressed up, have a day off from work potentially, put on a cute little hat, wave a flag around in the streets, listen to music. All of those things are human nature for us to crave and want, to break up the monotony of our humdrum lives. But there is something a little bit sinister with these types of celebrations that are also wrapped up in a sort of national quality. They are about national pride. Now, I know people are going to talk shit about me talking about this because I'm from America. Americans are supposedly like well known for flag waving and patriotism, but we basically have one day a year that is an out and out patriotic celebration in the streets. And I know not every year is there a royal wedding or a jubilee, but there are plenty of royal celebrations that have a nationalist bent to them that happen frequently enough that it does raise questions. Is there something that we should be wary of in public spectacle that is connected to nationhood? It is a very fine line between a celebration and propaganda. In this chapter, Scobie tries to discuss some of the historical shifts in this type of monarchist propaganda. What worked centuries or even a couple decades ago for the royal family don't work with today's population, with newer generations. Even something that we associate so much with the royal family, which are called walkabouts, are a recently modern invention of the Queen. Scobie notes there's a few reasons why this shift has happened from the royal family using most of their propaganda to show themselves as like distant elites lording over their subjects, to a focus more on handshaking and walkabouts with their own citizenry. One reason for the change is obviously the loss of the empire. Royal propaganda was usually focused on traveling to parts of the empire and demonstrating colonial might, but without the colonies anymore. This is starting to not work. And as was discussed in the chapter about Williams and Kate's tour of the Caribbean, it comes across as like extremely tone deaf. So that's not really the type of propaganda that they really want to focus on anymore. But not only with that, the British people have focused on more and more isolationism as time has gone on. Once they lost the empire, British people basically whinged and wanted to take their ball and go home. But despite having centuries and centuries of British people going as migrants to other countries, now that the migration is happening in reverse, British people don't seem to care much about the international mindedness of the monarchy. The monarchy as a symbol of global power is not interesting to British conservatives who are becoming more and more entrenched in a Britain first mentality. So instead of using the royal family to show a global superpower, the royal family now has to shift to focusing on their popularity within their borders, and specifically to play to a conservative pro-monarchist base. Scobie writes, quote, "Instead of waving to subjects from the backs of jeeps in far-flung lands, or dining out in black tie with European heads of state, senior members of the royal family found themselves more and more on country lane walkabouts, greeting their own citizens." But what this turned into is in some ways the Queen, or now the King, turning into a figurehead for Britishness, for British values. And if you're hearing any dog whistles in this phrase, good for you, you should. Quote, "Over time, the Queen and her advisors transformed the monarchy's image from a regal manifestation of empire and preeminent influence to a domestic expression of continuity, civic obligation, and enigmatic Britishness." But as Scobie also notes, the concept of Britishness has become even more and more of a dog whistle for Englishness. If you're an outsider, this might not seem like a massive difference, but to be British is to be part of the Union, to be part of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In some ways, the term British implies some level of multiculturalism. Now, it's not like great multiculturalism in the same sense that we have in the United States, but to say that you are British implies some sort of solidarity and mutual unity with, say, like a Scottish identity or a Welsh identity or a Northern Irish identity, that you can have those identities and be British. And all of those cultures are very different from English culture. And if you want to go down that path, you could make the argument that all of these places in the Union are still kind of being colonized by England. It's not really a unity of nations, but more so the nation of England dominating these 3 other nations that are closer to them. So as we've gotten a more and more conservative isolationist base, especially in England, Britishness has essentially become synonymous with Englishness. And when you start to identify with Englishness and English identity, you start to sound like a racist. I don't know why that is, but yeah, you start to sound like a white identitarian. Now, conservatism really relies on nostalgia. Nostalgia is a looking at history through rose-colored glasses. It's remembering the best parts of history and tradition, the parts that make us feel good, make us feel sentimental, while ignoring some of the darkness of the past. And the royal family becomes a way to sort of encapsulate nostalgia in a human family. The way that they live their life is a sign of this nostalgic past, of a sentimental past that they inhibit through their lack of change. Scobie notes that political theorist Tom Nair calls this the glamour of backwardsness. And the royal family is the quintessential icon of the glamour of backwardsness. They're backward in their routines, in their rituals, in their mannerisms, in their behaviors, and yet we see it as glamorous because it brings up a nostalgia of a different era, of a different time. But this energy can be harnessed by bad actors. Scobie has a great line here, which I absolutely love. He says, quote, "The list of those who have manipulated nostalgia for less than honorable purposes is a long one. It seems there's a strong human impulse to practice this dark art." And he goes on to discuss Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a great example of using this dark art of nostalgia. The phrase, "Make America Great Again," is a perfect encapsulation of the dark art of nostalgia. Great again implies that America had a moment in its past in which it was great. But a voter can only accept that premise if they are willing to ignore the myriad of ways in which the past was not great. And it is easy for those who are ignorant of history to fall into this narrative if their only understanding of history and the past is through glamorous media, not through interpretation of history, but with a remembrance through the media, through other talking points of this greatness, without actually analyzing what it would really be like to live in that era. And this is ignoring like basic things like, in the past it wasn't very nice to be a woman or gay or black or pretty much anything except a white man in pretty much all of the history of America. But just basically on the surface, there was no greatness back then. There was a lack of modern medicine. There was a lack of technology. Most people were living pretty menial existences. Labor laws weren't what they are now. Like, it would be miserable for anybody living today to want to go back to this somehow great past that is imagined in the phrase, "Make America Great Again." But in the way that Trump uses that manipulation of nostalgia, the royal family is doing it too. They are basically meant to represent "Make Britain Great Again." We are living this traditionalized life because in some ways it is superior to what we have now. That's why we maintain this tradition, because this tradition is more valuable than what we could have now. It's better, it's quainter, it's glamorous. As was discussed in previous chapters regarding Queen Elizabeth, this type of nostalgia was maybe a lot easier for people to buy into when the Queen had been on the throne for 70 odd years and already had her image plastered in all of these patriotic tokens. Back in a time period where it was more acceptable, people didn't really give it much thought that her face was on every coin, every mailbox, postage stamps, art, pop culture. And with her remaining on the throne for so long, this sort of nostalgia represented a sort of harmless quaintness to the Queen. This perpetual memory of the bygone era, of the strength in the war. Scobie even likens some of the iconography of the Queen to, quote, Franklin D. Roosevelt-like moments by the fireplace at Windsor Castle, warm and cheerful at Christmas gatherings with her family, in a hat for the day at the races or tiara for a state occasion. Her image was just this warm, cozy feeling, really meant to represent Christmas and the fireside and these warm, snuggly feelings. And perhaps because the Queen was on the throne for so long, this became essentially the blueprint for the firm to follow in how to market themselves. Quote, leveraging patriotism is tantalizing, low-hanging fruit and comes almost automatically for the firm, especially when they need to roll out the pageantry to remind the public of their value. But because this became so much of the institution's strategy, this reliance on nationalism almost became a crutch for the family. And that's dangerous because nationalism is dangerous. Third costume change. Forgive me if I sound a bit stuffy. I'm not feeling great, but the show must go on. Which leads us to Chapter 5, Baggage. One of my favorite quotes is at the beginning of this chapter. It's a quote from Kim Kardashian that goes, "There's a lot of baggage that comes along with our family, but it's like Louis Vuitton baggage." How perfect is that as an opening quotation for this next chapter? Mwah. Perfect. Omid Scobie, it's great. Chapter 5 is a discussion of some of the controversies that have surrounded King Charles that have a sort of political tinge to them. So this chapter, to me, is a breath of fresh air because it's one of the only royal biographies that I've read that really delves into the political nature of the monarchy, along with how some of these scandals lead to a lot of political questions. It opens up by talking about the Lord Chamberlain. In spring 2021, the Queen appointed a new Lord Chamberlain named Andrew Parker, a former British intelligence officer. The revolving doors between the firm, the government, and the press in the UK is fairly disturbing. It is, of course, something that also exists in the United States. Take the Republican to Fox News pundit pipeline, but it ends up leading to a lot of political questions since the monarchy is meant to be a sort of apolitical institution. But when they hire ex-government, it kind of makes me wonder how separate can these two institutions really be? But I digress. The job of the Lord Chamberlain is to be a liaison between the House of Lords and the monarch. The House of Lords, of course, is an actual part of the British government. It is the upper house of Parliament. So once again, we see that the system has a direct go-between between a part of the British government and the monarch. But Scobie also notes that the Queen thought of Parker as sort of the new CEO of the firm. Scobie explains that throughout the 70s and 80s, the firm had transformed the Lord Chamberlain position, quote, from a predominantly ceremonial position into an active, participatory job. With the introduction of Andrew Parker as the Lord Chamberlain, Scobie posits that this was the Queen's way of severing Charles's relationship to the previous Lord Chamberlain, Earl William Peel, who he was a close friend with, and putting in someone more sympathetic to her vision for the future of the monarchy, which again I think is a really interesting power play within the firm, and to me speaks to potentially people within the institution becoming kind of wary of how Charles was blurring the line, not only in how outspoken he was on certain political issues, but also maintaining close relationships with people who have also a governmental responsibility and a connection to the government that might look bad from the outside. And that maybe this is the firm's way of trying to maintain this sense of apoliticality, but maybe I'm misreading this, misinterpreting it, let me know. Scobie then goes on to document the Cash for Honor scandal.
This is shining a spotlight on him for all the wrong reasons, with some papers here calling it his cash in bags controversy.
The Sunday Times reporting this weekend the prince had accepted more than $3 million in cash donations. According to the
paper, between 2011 and 2015, the prince received a suitcase full of money on one occasion and carrier bags of cash on another. The money going to his charity, his spokesperson confirming the donations, saying charitable donations received from Sheikh Hamid bin Asim were passed immediately to one of the prince's charities, who carried out the appropriate governance and have assured us that all the correct processes were followed.
This seems to be about mid-2022. The Times of London releases a story, quote, about Prince Charles accepting bags of cash equaling 3 million euros from former Qatar Prime Minister Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim bin Jaber Al Thani between 2011 and 2015. Qatar in recent years has come under the microscope for a lot of human rights violations. There was a lot of scandal related to the Qatar World Cup, not only with, say, the construction of the stadiums for the World Cup, but also seemingly a corruption scandal with FIFA. It is also a country known for a vast gap between the haves and have-nots. Plus, the Prime Minister was considered one of the richest men in the world. So for Charles to be doing business with HBJ not only seemed super corrupt, but also seemed to lack any understanding of the optics of dealing with the Prime Minister of such a controversial country with so many potential human rights violations.
The optics on this look very bad for him because it questions his judgment as to why he's accepting money, large sums of money, in cash. You have to be squeaky clean. He has to now act more like a monarch and less like an heir to the throne if he wants that role as king.
Now, when this news was released, of course, the palace went into damage control, and pretty much the only justification that could be made was that what happened was probably not illegal. Now, probably not illegal is not the same as looks fucking corrupt to anyone with eyes and ears. Scobie writes, quote, "It was perceived to be a wildly irresponsible move for the future king to be casually accepting bundles of cash during a meeting with an official representing a country with an alarming record on human rights. Unconstitutional? Maybe not. Reckless? Most definitely." Regardless as to whether or not this was illegal at the time, you would think that this might be a wake-up call to the British public that maybe this should be illegal. I don't think that the head of state of one nation should be allowed to donate bags and bags of money to the head of state of another nation in a sort of hush-hush way between a middleman. And we'll get to Michael Fawcett as the middleman in a second. It was later then also reported that Charles had accepted cash from members of the Bin Laden family. Yes, that Bin Laden.
The report, published by the Sunday Times, disclosing that the Prince of Wales Charitable Fund accepted a donation of £1 million from Bakir and Shafiq bin Laden, both half-brothers of Osama bin Laden, in 2013. The Sunday Times report alleges the prince brokered the donation despite appeals from advisors not to take the money.
Now, the Bin Ladens that Charles accepted the cash from were not connected to terrorism, and sure, they cannot help that they are related to one of the most famous terrorist organization leaders of the last couple decades or so. And as said before, nothing about this seemed to be obviously illegal. But as Scobie writes, it seems obvious that accepting cash from a family tainted by the terrorism of one of its members is not necessarily a smart move.
It's a bad look for Prince Charles. The Charity Commission, which is the supervisory body of charities in this country, has basically said there's been no wrongdoing. But from the public's point of view, I'm afraid this is just another case of members of the royal family taking money from unsavory sources.
It also came out that Prince Charles had awarded a CBE, a Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, and yes, Empire is in the title, to Dr. Mahfouz Mareh Mubarak bin Mahfouz, who is a wealthy Saudi businessman, mogul type, but that the ceremony in which he was awarded the CBE was never officially recorded in palace records.
featuring this Saudi billionaire accused of trying to buy his way into British society, and one of Prince Charles's closest aides, Michael Fawcett, said to be the facilitator. He left the palace last September when details of the arrangements emerged. There was an internal investigation, but no police investigation until now.
So with everything that had already come out with Cash for Honors, it seemed very strange that there seemed to be other cases of wealthy individuals receiving honors in a sort of hush-hush, off-the-record sort of way. It then later turned out that a letter was leaked between Michael Fawcett, Prince Charles's valet, who, if you have watched any of my other TikTok videos and stuff like that, you might know him as one of the interesting characters that came up in Paul Burrell's book.
Michael Fawcett was just 17 when he started his royal career as a footman to the Queen. He rose the ranks quickly to become Prince Charles's valet and one of his closest advisors. Despite a series of controversies, including bullying allegations in 1998 and alleged racist comments, he was repeatedly brought back into the royal fold. In 2003, he resigned for the second time after an inquiry into selling royal gifts. But he continued to work with Prince Charles, first as a freelance party planner and then leading one of the prince's pet projects, the renovation of Dumfries House.
But anyway, in this letter between Michael Fawcett and Dr. Mahfouz, Fawcett basically outlined a quid pro quo arrangement for a donation of £370,000, which would go to renovating some of the royals' property. In exchange, Michael promised that Dr. Mahfouz would get a knighthood and aid in his application for British citizenship.
A letter with his signature leaked to the Sunday newspapers states in black and white that one of the prince's charities is happy and willing to support an application for citizenship, and that they will apply for an honorary CBE to be made a knighthood.
This is extremely infuriating for me. I have also posted a video on my TikTok talking about the British citizenship test, and the pathways to citizenship in Britain are like all messed up right now. The citizenship tests have gotten harder over time. The government has done as much as possible to slow or stop all types of migration to the United Kingdom. And for Michael Fawcett to basically be claiming that the monarch has the power to make all of that go away and to aid in the path to citizenship is infuriating. This should not happen in any democratic nation at all. Like never, 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 never. There should not be a way to skip the line by donating money to the head of state of the nation. That's crazy. Thankfully, the press also thought that this was crazy because this led to a full-fledged investigation.
What I'm calling for, first of all, is not for the Princess Foundation to investigate it because they are compromised. That's judged and due in your own court. The serious allegation, which is that an honour was offered for sale, needs to be investigated by the police because it's a criminal offence, if proven, under the 1925 Honours Act. Beyond that, the whole issue of how Prince Charles raises money needs to be properly investigated.
And it was that correspondence that led to this statement today from the Met, which said that its officers had liaised with the Prince's Foundation and an investigation will now commence. It added that there had been no arrests or interviews under caution.
Unfortunately, though, the Met's investigation into this went absolutely nowhere, and they announced, quote, no further action would be taken over the alleged honors for sale incident. Now, you might think, this seems corrupt as hell. Yeah, it does.
If this was a politician, this would be all over the news and people would be asking very serious and searching questions.
Is your accusation that the police didn't do their job properly because of who was involved?
Not even speaking to Charles is appalling. I mean, that is a dereliction of duty. I mean, they seem very quick to arrest those who protest against royal corruption and very slow to deal with those who are accused of it.
And I think the big question that Scobie is really positing in this chapter is, how much is the British public going to take of obvious corruption in your face? And not only that, what's extra interesting about the Cash for Honors scandal is that it seems to sit uncomfortably next to all of the racism of the family and the racist base that they are courting, which we kind of talked about in the previous chapter. A lot of these Cash for Honors scandals are dealing with outsiders who are non-British, not only outsiders, but coming from countries with serious human rights violations, serious problems, wealthy leaders and businessmen who have shady connections and seem to be the antithesis of all of this Britishness, British values that we saw in the previous chapter. They are also non-white, but somehow they are being treated to the highest level of honors, to even British citizenship, because of their generous donations to Charles, and then are given the honors that are supposed to get them respect from the British public. It's a very weird thing to square, that the royal family would treat these supposed foreigners, the people that don't have British values, the people that supposedly these racist conservatives don't want in their country. But as long as you have enough money to line Charles's pocket, suddenly you got plenty of British values. The British value of cold, hard cash. How long is the British public really going to accept this type of blatant hypocrisy, blatant corruption, a lack of cohesiveness between these values? How long is that going to go on? Or is it going to continue on forever if we allow this to continuously be swept under the rug, be ignored by journalists, be ignored by the police, and the institution just gets to hope that it goes away and that the public will be distracted by whatever bullshit about Harry and Meghan they print next week? Scobie also gives a little bit more information about the relationship between Michael Fawcett and Prince Charles that I find fascinating. Fawcett has worked for the royal family since 1981. He started as a footman for Queen Elizabeth II. This is also around the same time as Paul Burrell, which is why Fawcett came up quite a lot in that book. Also around the same time as Burrell, the two started to move into Prince Charles's camp. And Fawcett started to become the immediate kiss-ass that Charles wanted from day one. He became Charles's go-to for everything. But Michael Fawcett was not without any of his controversies. First, staff in the 1990s alleged that Michael Fawcett made racist and rude remarks to other staff, which meant that he was briefly let go from the position. But with a bullshit internal investigation, he was allowed back into the fold once again, where he was then caught in a different scandal for selling unwanted gifts that had been given to Prince Charles by foreign diplomats and dignitaries, pawning off those items, and then he would receive a cut of the profits. This is where Fawcett earned the nickname Fawcett the Fence. Now again, this was seen as not technically illegal, but probably a really bad move. So the palace eventually coerced Charles to let Fawcett go, which he was very hesitant to do because Charles and Michael Fawcett seemed to be completely inseparable at this point. But once Fawcett left, that was not the end of Charles and Fawcett's relationship. Fawcett then set up a new management company called Premier Mode, and then Charles hired Fawcett from this now separate company as a freelance consultant to basically head all of Charles's projects like the Prince's Foundation. So yes, Fawcett wasn't technically on the palace's payroll anymore, but he was still working with Charles as a separate entity, as a freelance consultant, and still being paid by the palace, if that makes sense. It wasn't until the final Cash for Honor scandal, with the leaked letter from Michael Fawcett as the sort of smoking gun of the whole scandal, that once again, Charles had to let go of Michael Fawcett, at least publicly. But given the history that Fawcett and Charles have had throughout decades and decades of these schemes, it seems very, very unlikely that this is the last we're going to hear of Michael Fawcett and his connection to Charles. Another sort of eyebrow-raising scandal was uncovered by a charity watchdog that was looking into purchases made in connection to the Prince's Foundation in a village called Knockaroon, which was some sort of sustainable development project, which a group called the Havisham Group which is partially owned by one of the richest men in Britain, spent £1.7 million on some of the properties in this Knockroon Sustainable Development Project. But David Brownlow, that richest man, was also on the Prince's Foundation's board, which would mean that he had failed to disclose the necessary information to charity regulators about the money that he had invested into the project. He left the charity, but coincidentally, he happened to get an honor out of the whole deal. He got a CVO, a Commander of the Victorian Order, in recognition of his role of chair of the charity of the Prince's Foundation for building community. But these projects basically ended up ruining the value of the properties as they were acquired. Scobie notes that experts were saying that this project didn't really make any sense. Because in a working class area, who is going to want to move into these sort of quasi-historical looking buildings that were actually modern buildings? And also half of the buildings weren't even completed at the time. The whole project just didn't seem to make any sort of sense. Prince Charles bought the Dumfries house for £43 million, but he couldn't pay for it all up front, so he took a £20 million loan through the foundation. The bank was originally skeptical to give him the full amount of that loan until they were given blueprints for a plan to develop Knockroon, the land surrounding Dumfries house. But as Scobie notes earlier, only 31 homes were built over 10 years in Knockroon. Now, could this just all be bad investments? Absolutely. And it would not surprise me that Charles just doesn't have anybody to tell him, no, these are stupid ideas, these are bad investments, don't waste your money. But it could also point to some, and I'm not an expert in property law and taxation and all that stuff, okay, so don't listen to me. But it does seem strange that the plan to develop Knockroon only came in connection to this loan that Charles tried to take out to get Dumfries' house. That doesn't seem to have been the original intention of buying, but then Knockroon became a sustainable development project that kind of half-assedly was done. But even though it was kind of half-assedly done, Charles was still able to convince somebody to give him £1.7 million to build houses in the area. Something's just not making any sense. Something about this is just so strange. And then they just didn't disclose it to their charity regulators. Like, why? It almost seems like Charles is like always coming up with weird fucking harebrained schemes to get more money, which is terrifying. As the head of state of the nation, he's using his power as the head of state to enrich himself. I mean, you could say that's basically what the monarchy is, but yeah. I mean, that's pretty Trumpian if you think about it. Like, that's like part of our nightmare with Trump, is how Trump used his position as head of state, not just for tangible financial benefit, but for connections and quid pro quos and back rubs and tit for tats and all those kinds of relationships that could help enrich himself, both during and after the presidency. Scobie then goes on to posit, well, why did all of this cash for honors stuff come out in the first place? Who was leaking all of that information? Now, Scobie admits it does sound a little bit conspiracy theory, but that it kind of makes sense that someone deep within the political establishment was unhappy with Charles because he had privately criticized the Rwanda plan of the conservative government. Now, Scobie writes in the book, quote, Charles had privately criticized the British government over their plan to deport Rwandan asylum seekers back to their home country. I'm not sure if I'm just getting something confused here, or maybe Scobie is not very clear with how he's written in this book, but the Rwanda plan is not about Rwandan asylum seekers as far as I understand. It is a plan of the British government to send asylum seekers of all backgrounds that end up in the United Kingdom to ship them to Rwanda instead of granting them asylum in the British Isles. They would be granted asylum, but in Rwanda. But again, maybe I'm getting this confused with some other plan. But anyway, Charles criticized this, apparently. Charles then allowed for this to be briefed to the press. But of course, this raised the hackles of people within the British government, because again, this seemed to be the monarch who's supposed to be apolitical, or the soon-to-be monarch, commenting on a government policy. But I don't even think that's the part that they were upset about. I don't think they actually have a problem with Charles commenting on government policy, but it was the fact that Charles criticized the policy that the Conservatives really had a problem with. So Scobie is essentially positing that because of these comments in June 2022, this would lead to the dark secrets of Charles being put out there with the Cash for Honor scandal, which started to get leaked around a similar time. Now, this is the chapter that has something that the press has gone frickin' apeshit over, which is that Scobie reveals that there was private correspondence between Charles and Meghan. This correspondence was in relation to the ongoing tensions between Harry and Meghan and the rest of the royal family due to the accusations of racism or unconscious bias or whatever the hell. I can confirm, as with all other English copies of the book, that Scobie writes, quote, "But in the pages of these private letters, two identities were revealed. Laws in the United Kingdom prevent me from reporting who they were." And then the internet blew up, okay? The world was engulfed in flames as the Dutch translation of this book, through all of the checking and whatnot, somehow accidentally printed that the two names revealed to be the royal racists, or the royals that have made racist comments, were Charles and Kate. Now, I'm not going to comment on that because, one, it's not in my copy of the book, so I don't really have anything to say on it. Two, it's not really that surprising, honestly. And three, I really think that the conversation being so focused on who are the royal racists is like completely missing the forest for the trees. It doesn't matter who are the specific royal family members that made racist comments that Harry and Meghan heard. Who cares, right? The entire institution is a racist institution. The entire monarchy is an unfair class structure. It is an amalgamation of every ism you can think of. You don't need to find the individual people that have made these comments to understand as a whole all of the issues that this institution has. And the book has so much more to discuss about all those different facets. So to focus on who was the one person or the two people that made racist comments is like irrelevant. So moving on from that, I'm going to read one paragraph that I think is a great summation of where Charles fits into this whole chess strategy of the Endgame. Scobie writes, quote, "The leaks about his finances and ongoing charity scandals only compound the resentment and disapproval expressed by many about his role as king. As for the institution and the establishment, there are some within it who still see him as a waffler and a dilettante. He remains a question mark to the bureaucrats and eminence grise who privately and publicly run Britain's economic interests and maintain the country's social order." Scobie goes on to also say, quote, "The king lives a life of luxury and comfort that is even alien to other members of the royal family, a throwback to monarchs of the past." And I think that is the biggest takeaway, is that Charles is living in a deluded fantasy world that is at once a massive throwback in the sort of extravagant life that he wants to live, but his behavior and his attitude is very confusing for the establishment to deal with because he's so outspoken politically, because he makes all sorts of crazy decisions, because he doesn't listen to anybody and keeps making the same mistakes over and over and over again. Look at the Michael Fawcett saga, for example. How many times can you hire and fire and rehire this same person over and over again before you realize that maybe this is a bad look for you optically? But the problem is Charles doesn't care. He has no shame. He doesn't listen to no. He's never been told no. He wants to live fat as a monarch of old. And in that way, it makes him really frustrating for the rest of the political establishment. Because if he doesn't hold together all of these conservative values, then he's gonna make them look all bad. And if he makes all of them look bad, either by openly criticizing them or just doing shady shit, he could very well mess it up for a lot of people in positions of power. Another great ending line for the chapter from Scobie also encapsulates this nicely. The reality is that to many who watched as Charles was anointed with holy oil on May 6th, 2023, to confirm him as the head of the Church of England, the man in front of the Archbishop of Canterbury was still a philandering husband and an unwise collector of bags of money. And speaking of being unwise, chapter 6. The fall of Prince Andrew. Now, to be honest, I don't want to dwell on chapter 6 for too long because frankly, it's just depressing to me. I think Virginia Giuffre deserved a lot better justice in this case than what she got. I mean, it's whatever that it got settled out of court, but it more so speaks to the fact that Prince Andrew gets to walk around as a free man, and the family is continuously inviting him back into the fold after what we know about his relationship to Jeffrey Epstein and the allegations of Virginia Giuffre. It's dystopian. It's a nightmare.
Virginia says she was trafficked to many men, but the prince was the most high profile. How did you learn that you were going to be trafficked to him?
I, was woken up by Guylaine in the morning and told I was going to meet a prince. And up till then, I should have known, but I didn't even know that I was going to be trafficked that night to him. And we went shopping and Prince Andrew came over, and then we went to Club Tramp, and he danced with me, and he's a horrific dancer, by the way, and he sweats a lot, and he smells funny. And then we get in the car, and Andrew's not in the car with us. He's in the car behind us with his security guards. And Guylaine tells me in the car that I have to do what I do for Jeffrey for Prince Andrew. And that's when I learned what was going to happen.
I know that this is probably a difficult subject for anybody that has had to go through SA and see the perpetrators of crimes against them walk away or be able to walk freely in society. This story might be unsettling to a lot of people. It's very unsettling to me. And so I just don't think I have the energy to really delve into it. I think we can all just agree, right? Prince Andrew is a predator. He's a predator that is allowed to walk freely in the royal family. Wild. The biggest things that came out of Scobie's analysis in this chapter is that Prince William seems to be the one sane voice that realized that the family had to do something about the Prince Andrew situation. Because Prince Andrew had always been seen as the favorite of the Queen, she seemed, quote, distraught over how the media and the public had so quickly turned against Andrew. They're all so in their own world that to them, this is like a sad moment. And while, yes, I can sympathize with the sadness at realizing that your brother or your son is a predator, but not for the predator. That's not the part you should be upset about. But again, they're so in their own crazy worlds. But good on William to be the one sane voice in the room to be like, hey, this is a bad look. But what also is strange about this chapter is that it highlights Prince Andrew's unwillingness to cut off contact with Jeffrey Epstein, but also his willingness to hang out with a bunch of other shady characters, which seems to be a pattern with the children of the Queen. They seem happy to schmooze with people that they probably should not be schmoozing with, and they don't seem to take on anybody's advice that maybe they shouldn't hang out with these people. A former business associate of Epstein even said in relation to Prince Andrew's continuing relationship with him, quote, "My wife and I cut things off there and then. Almost all of us did. Andrew didn't. That was a stupid decision and one, for the life of me, I can't understand. No one can be that stupid, except if you're in the royal family, in which case you're allowed to be stupid over and over and over again."
In 2006, in May, an arrest warrant was issued for Epstein for sexual assault of a minor.
Yes.
In July, he was invited to Windsor Castle to your daughter Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday. Why would you do that? In 2008, he was convicted of soliciting and procuring a minor for prostitution. He was jailed. This was your friend. How did you feel about it?
Well, I ceased contact with him after I was aware that he was under investigation. And that was later on in 2006.
He was released in July. Within months, by December of 2010, you went to stay with him at his New York mansion. Why? Why were you staying with a convicted sex offender?
Right. I have always, ever since this has happened, and since this has become, as it were, public knowledge that I was there, I've questioned myself as to why did I go, what was I doing, and was it the right thing to do?
Prince Andrew was still meeting with Jeffrey Epstein when he was under house arrest. If you know anything about the Jeffrey Epstein case, Epstein was actually prosecuted twice. And the first time he was given like a slap on the wrist in house arrest. And so after he had already been tried for grooming minors, children, like that came out in a court of law, Prince Andrew was still having lunch with him. Not only is this stupid on just a personal level. Like, why would you want to hang out with a dude that has been trafficking minors? Unless you also want to deal with trafficked minors. But also, he is a prince. He's in the royal family. He has scrutiny. He has eyes on him constantly. Everybody that he's associated with is going to become public knowledge sooner or later. And yet he does not have any sort of self-awareness at how bad this might be optically, that he's hanging out with a convicted predator. Just stupid, just stupid. One source told Omid Scobie, quote, "Just like he ignores tabloid rumors about his own family and friends, he did the same when it came to what people said about Epstein." I'm gonna call that out for a second. This was not tabloid gossip. This was not tabloid rumors. He was under house arrest. This isn't a rumor. In the mind of a royal, if you don't see it with your own two eyes, and it's written in a paper, how can you trust it? The whole media landscape from the British royal family perspective is just incomprehensible. Like, Andrew cannot even understand how the process of the legal system works in America enough to realize that they're not just going to put Epstein under house arrest for some rumor. None of the justifications that people are trying to give him that, oh, he just was giving Epstein the benefit of the doubt, none of these make any sense. And so the most obvious logical conclusion is that they don't make any sense because Prince Andrew didn't care that Jeffrey Epstein was a predator. And if he didn't care that Jeffrey Epstein was a predator, why was he hanging out with him? Maybe, just maybe, it was because he was also a predator. And that's scary and sad that the royal family is protecting essentially a known predator. Scobie goes through the entire saga of Prince Andrew trying to deny the allegations of Virginia Giuffre, doing that horrible television interview.
Do you remember meeting her at all?
No.
Do you know you didn't meet her, or do you just not remember meeting her?
No, I don't know if I've met her, but no, I have no recollection of meeting her.
Because she was very specific. She described the dance that you had together in Tramp. She described meeting you. She was a 17-year-old girl meeting a senior member of the royal family.
Never happened.
She provided a photo of the two of you together.
Yes.
Your arm was around her waist.
Yes.
You've seen the photo.
I've seen the photograph.
How do you explain that?
I can't. Because I have absolutely no memory of that photograph ever being taken.
Do you recognise yourself in the photo?
Yeah, it's pretty difficult not to recognise yourself.
Your friend suggested that the photo is fake.
I think it's, from the investigations that we've done, you can't prove whether or not that photograph is faked or not, because it is a photograph of a photograph of a photograph. So it's very difficult to be able to prove it. But I don't remember that photograph ever being taken.
But it's possible that it was you with your arm around
That's
her
me, but whether that's my hand or whether that's the position, but I have simply no recollection of a photograph ever being taken.
Scobie notes that he didn't express any sympathy to Epstein's victims. Like, ignore Virginia Giuffre for a moment, but there were plenty of other victims of Jeffrey Epstein that have been proven, that were known of, that were speaking up against him, and Prince Andrew offered them no sympathy, no apology, no grace, nothing. Andrews also tried to brief the Telegraph and the Evening Standards, two of the royal family's most favorite sympathetic newspapers, that the photo that Virginia Giuffre provided of her standing next to Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell was some sort of digital alteration. But, quote, the FBI had already confirmed the authenticity of the 4x6 original, noting that the timestamp on the back of the print proved Giuffre had it developed in a store near her former home in Florida, 3 days after she returned from her 2001 trip to London. So here we have Prince Andrew actively spreading disinformation to the British press to try to cover his ass in the midst of an ongoing investigation. Journalistic integrity, where? What? Telegraph? Evening Standard, hello? Hello? What's your job? Is your job to parrot disinformation from Prince Andrew's legal team? Or is your job to actually report the facts? The palace also seems to have successfully threatened ABC into not publishing an interview between Amy Robach and Virginia Giuffre. On a hot mic, Robach said, quote, the palace found out that we had her whole allegations about Prince Andrew and threatened us a million different ways. We were so afraid that we wouldn't be able to interview Kate and Will. I tried for 3 years to get it on to no avail. What? Sounds like a cover-up to me. Why would they threaten ABC a million different ways if Virginia Giuffre was telling a lie? Why would they care? Why wouldn't they just sue Virginia Giuffre for defamation? No, because they don't have anything. They just want to silence. They just want it to all go away so that they can pretend that Prince Andrew is not a predator. That's scary and dangerous. The list of shady characters that Prince Andrew has associated himself with is longer than just Jeffrey Epstein. Scobie notes that Andrew has been seen with the president of Kazakhstan. Now, I say president, but he's definitely like an autocrat, oligarch type. And it just so happened that the president's son also casually paid $5.6 million to buy one of Andrew and Fergie's old dilapidated properties. It's a lot of weird property schemes going on here in the royal family. He is also met with a, quote, convicted gun smuggler, Tariq Kaitouni. He also dined with Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, who Scobie helpfully reminds us was responsible for the Lockerbie terrorist bombings, which is one of the biggest domestic terrorist incidents in British history. Wow, what British values? Meeting with a dictator that actively colluded against your own citizens to commit an act of terrorism. Wow, so patriotic. He also met with the dictator of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, who has been, quote, accused of stealing elections and violently persecuting journalists and political opponents. As if meeting with the dictator of Azerbaijan was not scary enough? Quote, sources initially claimed it was a one-time meeting, but as it turned out, the pair had met in secret 11 times. 11 times. How many times do you think that you would meet with the dictator of Azerbaijan, who committed gross human rights violations? Someone that's a sign of like the antithesis of democracy and good governance. Just wild. Just absolutely wild. And on top of this infuriating Sunday, Scobie also notes that he filed a FOIA request to figure out where Andrew had been traveling all this time on the government's expense. But the Foreign Office, quote, claimed that the documents won't be available until 2065. What do you think the purpose of FOIA is for? Just absolutely freaking baffling to me. This is wrong on so many levels. The lack of transparency with the royal family, all the shady dealings, this is really unsavory. And the fact that the British public isn't out there with fucking pitchforks tearing these people down just drives me nuts. Drives me absolutely batty. And listen, I'm not saying that like the US government and stuff is like super transparent, but there is a massive, massive difference between how the lack of accountability and transparency works with the royal family and with like the president of the United States. Not so much in the judicial branch, and that's really, really frustrating. But essentially, this is just a whole unchecked part of the British government in which money is freely flowing between the monarchical institution and like ruthless dictators and oligarchs and tyrants into the pockets of the British royal family in exchange for honors or in exchange for property and this and that. Why? Why is your government set up this way? Why is that allowed to continue? And to summarize the chapter, Omid quotes a source who says, "One would be foolish to assume that Andrew won't bring further shame. It's his speciality. For his brother, the king, for Christ's sake, to be blindly supporting him, despite the great risk he poses to this entire thing, is crazy." And I think that's the best word to end on. It's crazy. These people are crazy, and nobody seems to be able to stop them from being crazy. They've created a whole system in which their craziness is completely unchecked. There are no checks and balances in the monarchy. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from Endgame for me. No one is able to keep them in check, keep them in line. They're a big gamble. They're not actually very good at optics. They're so disconnected from reality that they seem incapable of good optics. And there is growing resentment against the entire concept of monarchy as a whole. So in terms of whether or not the monarchy can survive is yet to be seen. Costume change number 4. In time to read the final chapter, number 7. Race and the Royals. Institutional bigotry and denial. This chapter does a really good job of showing the power of white woman tears. One of the unfortunate side effects of not taking racism seriously is that when racism is called out, oftentimes it turns into a comforting of those who are called out for racism. It's people who are so upset at the idea of somebody being called racist or being told that what they are saying or doing is racist that they feel a need to sort of protect the person that's being accused of racism rather than address the racism. And it's a common deflection tactic that turns into almost like blaming the victim for calling out racism because it might upset or offend the person who's being called out. It's a way to prioritize the feelings of, let's face it, white people over the feelings of those who are impacted by racism. And what better way to illustrate this point than to start the chapter with the most racist member of the British royal family, Princess Michael of Kent. Princess Michael of Kent is like if you distilled British racism into like one person. Not necessarily always screaming the N-word, but also never shying away from an excuse to be racist. One of Princess Michael and Kent's most famous examples of being racist in public is when she arrived to a Christmas luncheon in 2017. One of the first times she ever met Meghan Markle, she wore a blackamoor brooch, a type of depiction of a black African man that is obviously culturally insensitive to a modern audience. This got picked up by the press, who obviously called her out for it. I mean, the British press can be racist, but like, they do have a line, you know? Dog whistling, sure. Wearing a black man as jewelry, eyebrows are gonna be raised. But in true white woman tears fashion, Scobie reveals that a source stated that, quote, some of the family rushed to comfort her afterward. They didn't feel the media onslaught was fair. Why is it unfair to be called out for doing something racist? What part of that is unfair? Apparently calling someone out for a breach of protocol, like not wearing the right hat, that's fair. Using racist dog whistles to report on Meghan Markle, that's fair. But calling out an obviously racist old woman for doing something racist, that's not fair. And why is that? Because at the end of the day, what matters more is the feelings of the white people in the royal family to the exclusion of all minority voices. That's it. Anything that might disrupt or upset or make white people question what they have always known or what they think that they've always known to be true or moral or correct is seen as an affront, is seen as rocking a boat that any other type of call out or criticism is not seen as in the same way. Skimming ahead a little bit in the chapter, but I promise we'll go back, Scobie shows another example of this sort of white woman tears defense. When Scobie wrote about the departure of Melissa Tubati, one of the Sussex's assistants for his previous book, Finding Freedom, he tried to correct the record that she had been bullied by Meghan out of the institution. He writes, quote, "It was intriguing to see how quickly and thoroughly the palace defended her, from the palace's positive briefings all the way to a call I received in March 2021 from a senior Buckingham Palace communications aide after I reported details of the Sussex's side of the story on air. Omid, I need you to remember that there is a human being at the other end of these claims," they said. "Melissa has been very upset. Please remember that words have very real consequences." Now, true, words do have very real consequences. But when those words are racist, it seems like it doesn't matter that they have consequences. Only when they can harm white people do words matter. Only when a white person might have their feelings hurt do words matter. But when it has to do with harming a black woman, those words don't seem to matter anymore. In fact, they might be tacitly encouraged by the palace. This chapter does a really good job explaining Britain's history of racism and how racism manifests itself differently in the UK compared to, say, in the United States, in that the idea of racism, instead of being confronted, is typically denied and ignored. And in true British traditional fashion, this is how the royal family handles any issues related to race. Scobie notes that he felt it was necessary to call out the royal family for being silent on BLM in the UK. BLM obviously is a movement was started in the United States, but it had migrated over into the UK as a rallying cry, not against police brutality necessarily as it was in the United States, but as a call to end racism or to be anti-racist. Scobie notes, quote, leaders, activists, and public figures in the United Kingdom all spoke out on the issue, as did other royals in Europe. So the British royal silence, which followed almost 4 years of racially charged coverage of their only biracial family member, was hard to ignore. Not only could this have been an easy PR slam dunk for them, their silence seemed even more bizarre, considering that they now had a new biracial family member, for which the message of standing up against racism might have been a powerful message to that family member that they, had her back. To British people, because they don't talk about race as much, or racism, to them that silence makes them feel like they are less racist, or that racism doesn't exist because they don't talk about it as much. Now, of course, Britain does have racism. Scobie even counters the claim that the UK is the least racist European country by saying, quote, being the least racist country doesn't mean that there isn't racism. But because of this unwillingness to talk about race, racism has manifested itself in the UK as a lot more coded, a lot more dog whistly than maybe it appears in the United States, for example. Especially now. I mean, when I was growing up, they at least pretended they were dog whistles. Now they're just full-out whistles. They're like dog foghorns at this point. But what makes the silence of the British royal family more inexcusable than perhaps the lack of acknowledgement of racism from your average layperson is how racism directly benefited monetarily the royal family. Scobie says, quote, it was Queen Elizabeth I who legitimized slavery in 1562 when she allowed Naval Commander John Hawkins to kidnap Africans in his ship's cargo hold and sell them in the Caribbean. And during the reign of King Charles II, the Crown financed the African slave trade by founding and maintaining the Royal African Company of England, a trading operation that shipped more enslaved African men, women, and children than any other single institution during the entire period of the transatlantic slave trade. In 1712, Queen Anne landed an exclusive contract for the British nation to provide enslaved people for the Spanish West Indies for 30 years. When the government later sold the contract, Anne received a 20% cut of a £7.5 million deal, which equals approximately £355 million in 2023. And where did that money go? Directly into the inherited wealth of the British royal family that we see before us today. It's not like that money disappeared. It's not like when slavery ended, they returned all of that money back. Oh, we did a moral whoopsie, might as well rectify all of this with reparations. No, they still got to benefit from the slave trade that they essentially set up. Now, as an American, what is absolutely baffling to me is how little British people actually know about Britain's involvement in slavery and in the slave trade. As far as British people are concerned, the only thing that they ever learn in British history class about the slave trade is that it ended. They love to take the credit for ending it, but somehow they skip over the whole part where they started it and profited off of it and then did a colonialism across the world. They just never learn any of that. It's very bizarre to me as an American. It's like we've never skipped slavery in American history class. It's a pretty integral part of our history. It would be a a bit of a lie to like just quietly skip over all the slavery bits, considering we had a whole war over it. I'm genuinely curious. Should I look up the British national curriculum? Let's see. What are the standards? I'm curious. Yeah, according to the UK government's national curriculum documents for key stages 3 and 4, none of the required topics include slavery. They are the development of church, state, and society in medieval Britain, the development of church, state, and society from 1509 to 1745, which is when the slave trade began, ideas, political power, industry, and empire, 1745 to 1901, which under non-statutory examples includes, quote, Britain's transatlantic slave trade, its effects, and its eventual abolition. So not even the beginning of slavery or any of the horrors of slavery. It really notes the idea of like the effects and the eventual abolition of slavery are the focus. And even that is non-statutory. And then from 1901 to the present day, mostly the Holocaust, World War I, World War II. That's it. For a country that's entire purpose for like hundreds and hundreds of years was profiting off of the slave trade, was profiting off of empire. Nope. Not in the curriculum. Ugh, as a teacher, super frustrating for me. That's not education, my friends. Scobie notes the monarchy they represent, one that emphasizes bloodlines and hereditary power and was built on the backs of others, still profits from untaxed slave-era inheritances. A lot of the £652 million estate inherited by King Charles from the Queen, all untaxed, can be traced back to the slave trade and empire. And the response to all this? Resolute silence. And one of the obvious reasons that the royal family wants to remain silent on it is because they fear any challenge to the concept of monarchy. Because once you start to unpack, think through, question the entire system of monarchy itself, it's game over. The race question and the slavery question pokes a lot of holes in the monarchical mythos. Like, why was the royal family allowed to profit off of the slave trade in this manner? One way that the British royal family has refused to acknowledge racism in order to benefit themselves is when government ministers introduce laws making it illegal to refuse work to an individual on the grounds of their race or ethnicity. The Queen's former chief finance manager informed civil servants that it was, quote, not in fact the practice to appoint colored immigrants or foreigners to clerical roles in the royal household, although they were permitted to work as domestic servants. How kind of them. They could not be arsed even to follow anti-discrimination laws in their own country because they wanted to just keep being racist with no consequences. What? We might have to see non-white people not working as domestic servants in the palace? How will minorities know their place otherwise? Unsurprisingly, by creating such an undiverse workplace, the royal household becomes a place where casual racism is just commonplace. Like that Michael Fawcett example that we had a look at before. Scobie gives numerous examples of aides that just say casually racist things about Meghan Markle, for example. One courtier said, quote, Meghan should be more black and wear some African garb. Let her afro out at an engagement linked to Nelson Mandela. And when Jeremy Clarkson went on a racist, misogynistic hate screed in print, Camilla happily fraternized with him at a Christmas party. On top of creating a casually racist workplace environment, the royals have, of course, numerous examples of art, architecture, sculptures that contain racist tropes and stereotypes. Scobie even notes, quote, the Royal Collection Trust published a catalog that featured more than 40 uncensored uses of racist slurs, including the N-word, in its artifact descriptions. And, quote, despite calls from campaigners for a redesign, one of Britain's highest honor medals bestowed by King Charles to ambassadors and diplomats for distinguished service still features a depiction of Saint Michael, a blue-eyed white angel, standing on the neck of Satan, portrayed as a chained black man. Now, although we can say that these are historical artifacts, this shouldn't be used as a way to claim that the royal family is racist or anything. I totally agree with that. However, the treatment of racist imagery in your catalog of art is important to understand how you are going to move forward with the historical analysis of these artifacts and how you present them to the public. This is the conversation that museums have been having for decades at this point. There are museums that have plenty of racist iconography, but a lot of museums are working towards writing better descriptions to use them as educational tools, to explain the historical context in which this art was created, to discuss more openly some of the negative stereotypes depicted within them, and what they were trying to communicate to the audience. But the royal family doesn't seem to display this art with any type of description to try to explain the historical context or to try to discuss some of the problematic tropes and imagery within them. They are just displaying this art as if it's totally normal, as if this is just a fact of life that they have Blackamoor statues up in their houses. And so I think it's their response to all of that art and their lack of engagement with some of the problematic aspects that shows their willingness to uphold racism, rather than just the idea that they own this art, if that makes sense. It's fine to own art and artifacts that have problematic aspects to them, but it's how you treat those things, it's how you present those things, it's the conversations that you have around those artifacts that show whether you are trying to use them to uphold or perpetuate racism, or whether you're trying to use them in an anti-racist fashion. Scobie brings up another thing that is a great apologist line for the mainstream British media, which is, in the same vein that they love to talk about the fact that Britain abolished slavery as if abolishing the thing that you created you should get a pat on the back for, Scobie says, quote, "Spend enough time around certain journalists or outlets and you will find yourself hearing the hard-to-believe argument that the royal family has actually helped eradicate the colonial ties of the past. Quote, some commentators have also claimed that over the years the Queen did more to eradicate racism while in pursuit of an equal society than any other monarch or politician in British history." Now, I would argue switching from like absolute colonialism to neo-colonialism, I guess that's progress. But I wouldn't say that it's eradicating colonialism. But I think that this apologist argument comes from two different places. One is, again, the white woman tears argument. If you criticize the Queen, if you claim that she may have upheld racism by being part of the monarchical institution, that might upset her and her family's poor fifis. And so to dismiss that argument that we can have about the institution upholding racism, we can instead run all the way to the opposite side and say, well, actually, they're doing the right thing by caving into geopolitical pressures not to colonize the world anymore, I guess? I don't know. It's trying to give the Queen a lot more credit, basically because she wasn't as racist as maybe people were in the past, but that's just a very weak argument. But two, it's also kind of a non sequitur argument. Saying that the Queen, for example, is helping to eradicate the colonial past of Britain still does not address the colonial past of Britain. And if we start to get into an argument about how good or bad Queen Elizabeth was at modernizing the ties between Britain and their former colonies, we are still, again, only looking at the end of the process instead of wanting to understand the beginning of the process, which is, how did colonialism start? How did Britain get involved in colonialism? How did Britain start the slave trade? You see how focusing on the end part, it's the same thing with the slave trade thing. If you're focusing just on the abolition, you're not focusing on everything that led up to the creation of racism. Because racism, as an ideal was created in order to make the slave trade make sense. And this apologist argument is focusing on the end of colonialism instead of focusing on the royal family's participation in colonialism and how they benefited from it for hundreds and hundreds of years before we got to the modern Commonwealth as it is today. We're just like running all the way to the end. We don't even want to talk about the beginning. It doesn't make any sense. Scobie continues talking about the sort of racism in the press when Meghan entered the royal family and all of the dog whistles. I'm going to kind of skip over that because I've talked about that to death on this channel. But we get another example here of white people tears. Quote, as tabloid op-eds and online hate increased, so did the level of denial from palace aides who claimed they couldn't really see any racism in the press coverage. In the upside down dimension, some expressed sympathy for those in the press instead. A communications staffer at Kensington Palace comforted royal correspondents whom Twitter users had accused of being racist in their articles or commentary. I do think the Duke of Sussex and his office will bear some responsibility if a journalist is harmed as a result of that ill-judged statement, tweeted Daily Express royal editor Richard Palmer. Again, white people tears. Being called a racist upset these poor people's feelings. And that's more important than the actual disgusting, vile hatred of racism directed at a member of the royal family. Sympathy is extended to white people who get their feelings hurt, but it is not extended to a woman of color who is being targeted by racial hatred to the point of being unsafe and requiring extra security for herself and her children. And speaking of all of that racial hatred, remember when the palace had that words hurt, words have power? Do you remember that? Well, when it came to the social media accounts of the royal family, social media posts from the palaces were getting flooded with slurs, hate speech, dog whistling emoji, and all sorts of things that literally any other account on earth would censor to some degree. Like, the royal family is not like one of the only high-profile institutions to have a social media account. But when Harry approached the palace to ask them about banning certain keywords that, might be racist, the response was, quote, the office was aware, they said, but one of its higher-ranking aides felt that at the time it would be inappropriate to start censoring comments left for a publicly funded institution. Now, this is bonkers for a couple of reasons. One, being a publicly funded institution does not mean that you have to allow racist comments on your social media posts. What the hell are you talking about? The White House has social media posts. You could argue that the entire US government is full of institutions paid for by the American people. But it doesn't mean that they don't monitor their comments for racism. Like, the government can't stop you from being racist, but it doesn't mean the government has to allow you to be racist in the comments on their Instagram posts. But what's so bizarre is that these comments are sort of proof in the pudding that what Harry and Meghan were saying about the racist coverage was true, because it seemed like the royal family was now attracting a lot of racists to their comments. So now the royal family got to see with their own two eyes, or at least their press offices, the type of base that they were courting. And when they saw that base, they didn't go, those aren't the kind of people that we want to appeal to. No. In fact, it sounds like they almost wanted those people to stay, and they didn't want to silence them. And I think it's very telling, because then that means that the royal family knows that racists are part of their base. And if they know that, and they want to continue to appeal to that base, then it makes it a lot easier for them to rationalize courting the racists by using racism. And then we get back to the whole Trumpism argument. Whether or not the royal family is racist in their heart of hearts doesn't matter. In the same way that it doesn't really matter whether or not Donald Trump is a racist. What matters is that they are willing to court racists, and that becomes indistinguishable. Scobie later notes in the chapter, quote, "When Charles and Camilla received a barrage of negative comments on Clarence House Instagram posts after the premiere of the 4th season of The Crown, aides wasted no time in switching off the ability to comment on posts. Write the N-word on Instagram? Suddenly these people are all American, my free speech. Criticize Charles and Camilla for committing adultery for decades and abusing a teenager. No, no, no. This is not the correct forum for that kind of talk." Scobie writes, "The firm's protective shield, so often used when royals are in crisis, including Prince Andrew's never-ending ordeal, was never offered up to Meghan. The institution might claim it's not because of racism, but all of the reasoning as to why they didn't like Meghan seems to come from a racist mythology, that someone like Meghan should be grateful for being allowed into this space, that she was not inherently good enough to be there. She's not of the right class because of her personality, because of her being American, whatever word they want to put on it. It boiled down to she's not good enough, and yet she's still here. And because she's still here, she should be thankful she's here. She should be grateful she's here. So she should just put up and shut up. She's not worthy to be here anyway. So why should we take anything that she is saying into consideration, even when it's just, I don't want to be racially harassed for the rest of my life. I want to just read the last paragraph of this chapter because, as with every ending of these chapters, I think Scobie does an amazing job of wrapping everything up. And this paragraph is just perfect. If Meghan's presence didn't alter anything within the royal family or the institution of the monarchy, then perhaps nothing will. The firm doesn't like to be told what to do. Acclamation and change are not practices and values they have historically embraced, and a deferential press let them get away with it all, and at times has made it worse. The family's past will forever discolor their legacy, and their refusal to comprehensively address much of it only deepens the stain. By their very existence, the royal family as a symbol perpetuates the notion of empire and the class system. As a result, it's almost impossible to separate the three. To do so would require a full-scale operation geared towards redressing the firm in modern colors and populating the institution with diverse opinions and forward-thinking ideas, including a new governing transparency. It's a tall order for a monarchy that stretches back to 1066, and one that desperately relies on tradition, mystery, and memories of the grand old times for its survival. There are just too many blackamoor pieces and tainted historical artifacts that can be neither retained nor explained. And with that, I think we're done for the first half of Endgame. I'm so excited to talk about the rest of the book. There's plenty more interesting things to come. But for now, we are done. Thank you so much for watching and joining me in the Catella Bubble once again. Remember to subscribe, hit the little bell, click the like button, and write a comment. What did you think of Endgame? What parts of it were you the most interested in? Were there any parts of the first half that you found interesting that I didn't touch on? And what do you think is the best strategy for the monarchy going forward? They are very bad at planning a strategy. I think whatever strategy they go with is gonna be not very good. But like, if you could be the PR team for the royal family, what would your advice be to them? And do you think that the British public is going to get tired of this? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to me rant and rave about all that fun stuff. And I'll see you for part 2. Bye.
Who is the imaginary reader that you have in mind for Endgame?
The reader for Endgame is someone who has an interest in the royal family but doesn't like to be dictated what to think about them by the likes of the Daily Mail. And I felt that there wasn't a place in the market where anyone was talking to that person. I do also think it's for royalists and anti-monarchists too, but I think it's that the person who's right now having or up for conversations about its role in our society today. You know, when I was part of the coverage for ABC News, where I also work, for the Queen's funeral, one of the things we spent so much time focusing on were kind of how she upheld a certain level of like morals and values, ethics, principles, key for a role of head of state, but also the head of the Church of England. My question is like, how much do the current working royals also uphold those same morals, ethics, standards and principles? And if they're not, what does that look like? And what does that look like behind palace walls?